There is a question hidden inside the oldest stories of India, a question so simple that a child could ask it and so large that entire traditions have spent centuries trying to answer it. If the gods once walked close to the human world, if the age of direct contact really existed, then where did they go? And more importantly, when do they return? The answer given by the tradition is not a date circled on a modern calendar. It is stranger than that. It is a story about time itself, about great ages that rise and fall like breath, about a world that becomes brighter, then heavier, then more confused, until finally it reaches a point where confusion can no longer deepen without revealing itself. The ancient name for the darkest part of that cycle is Kali Yuga. Most people have heard the name and stop there. They imagine Kali Yuga as a label for everything that feels wrong with the modern world. Violence, greed, noise, corruption, loneliness, false teachers, broken families, polluted rivers, restless minds. But the old texts are doing something more careful than simply complaining about decline. They are describing a pattern, a stage in a cycle, a time when Dharma, the deep order that holds human life, nature, duty, truth, and the sacred in relationship with one another, becomes harder to recognize and harder to live. And yet the same tradition that describes the darkness also insists on something that changes the entire meaning of the story. Kali Yuga is not endless. No age is endless. The wheel turns. What descends must eventually rise. What becomes hidden can become visible again. What seems absent can return. Tonight, we are going to follow that question all the way through. Not as a prediction of a date that anyone can prove, not as a promise that a dramatic event will happen tomorrow or next year. The ancient sources themselves are interpreted in more than one way, and honesty matters. Some traditions place the end of Kali Yuga unimaginably far in the future. Other teachers have proposed shorter cycles and a much earlier turning. We will look at both. We will also look at the signs the Puranic tradition associates with the age, the figure of Kalki, the meaning of the white horse and the sword, the idea of a twilight between ages, and the deeper possibility that the return of the divine may begin long before the world recognizes it. Because perhaps the most important part of the old story is not the question, when will the gods return? Perhaps it is the question beneath it, what would have to change in human beings for us to recognize them if they did? Chapter 1. The Age of Forgetting. Imagine being born in a city where no one has ever seen the stars, not because the stars disappeared, but because generation after generation built brighter lights. Streets became brighter, houses became brighter, towers became brighter, screens filled every room. The night sky slowly faded behind a pale glow until children grew up without ever seeing the Milky Way. Their parents had barely seen it. Their grandparents remembered it faintly. Eventually, the idea of a sky crowded with stars began to sound exaggerated, poetic, almost impossible. Then imagine an old book survives from a time before the lights. It speaks casually about the stars, as if everyone knows them. It describes their movement, their brightness, the way travelers use them for direction. To the people living in the glowing city, the book sounds mystical. But the stars were never mystical. The sky was simply hidden by something the city had built around itself. This is one way to understand what the Indian traditions mean when they speak about Kali Yuga. The sacred is not necessarily destroyed. Human beings lose the conditions that once made it obvious. In the classical Hindu picture of time, history does not move in a straight line from primitive to advanced. It turns through great ages called Yugas. The details vary by source and interpretation, but the familiar sequence is Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. Each age is associated with a different condition of Dharma and a different quality of human awareness. Satya Yuga is remembered as the age of truth. Dharma stands firmly. The distance between what is true and what human beings recognize as true is small. Spiritual knowledge does not need to fight through endless distraction because the structure of life itself supports it. The sacred is not a special interest, it is woven into the ordinary. Treta Yuga is still luminous, but something begins to change. What was natural begins to require effort. The ritual becomes more important. Discipline becomes more important. The human being must deliberately maintain a relationship that earlier ages received more easily. In Dwapara Yuga, the distance grows further. Knowledge becomes specialized. Great teachers, sages, kings, and avatars become crucial because ordinary people increasingly depend on transmission. What one person directly realizes, another receives through story, teaching, ritual, lineage, or faith. Then comes Kali Yuga, the age in which truth is still present but difficult to recognize. the age in which appearance can replace substance, the age in which a person can know many facts and still lack wisdom, the age in which sacred language can survive while the experience that gave birth to that language becomes faint. The Sanskrit word Kali, in this context, is not simply the name of the goddess Kali. The terms are different in origin and meaning. Kali Yuga is traditionally associated with conflict, discord, confusion and decline in Dharma. It is an age in which the center does not hold easily. That last point matters, because it changes the way we read the old warnings. A dark age is not dark because every person becomes evil. That would be too simple. Human beings remain mixed, capable of kindness and cruelty, intelligence and foolishness, devotion and selfishness in every age. The darkness of Kali Yuga is more structural. It is the increasing difficulty of seeing clearly while living inside conditions that reward confusion. Think about how easily a false appearance can become more powerful than reality. A person may spend years becoming wise, but another person can look wise in 30 seconds. A life of discipline is quiet. The appearance of discipline can be photographed. Genuine knowledge is slow. The appearance of knowledge is fast. Character is tested in private. Reputation is manufactured in public. This is not an argument that the ancient seers predicted social media. That claim would be too easy and too careless. It is something more interesting. Human weaknesses are old. The technologies change. The scale changes. The speed changes. But vanity, greed, imitation, status, fear, and the desire to be seen have existed for as long as human beings have told stories about themselves. A text can describe a human pattern without predicting the device through which that pattern later becomes amplified. And Kali Yuga is, above all, an age of amplification. Small desires become industries, small distractions become environments, small fears become markets, small divisions become identities. Every impulse that once appeared and disappeared inside the mind can now be fed, repeated, personalized and returned to us until it begins to feel like the world itself. The old texts often describe the decline of Dharma through inversion. Things remain, but their meaning changes. Leadership remains, but power can be separated from responsibility. Learning remains, but information can be separated from wisdom. Religion remains, but display can be separated from devotion. Wealth remains, but abundance can be separated from contentment. Speech remains, but words can be separated from truth. That is why the age is unsettling. Nothing has to disappear completely. The shell can survive after the center weakens. A temple can remain standing while the mind that enters it is somewhere else. A sacred verse can be repeated while no one allows it to change the way they live. A teacher can speak beautifully without having conquered the desires he teaches others to conquer. A student can collect books without becoming more honest. A society can speak constantly about freedom while becoming less able to sit quietly with a single thought that was not chosen for it by someone else. This is the deeper meaning of forgetting. Forgetting is not the same as losing information. Sometimes forgetting happens while information multiplies. You can possess thousands of teachings and forget why a teaching exists. You can know the names of the gods and forget what those names are supposed to awaken. You can memorize the map and lose the desire to travel. You can inherit a ritual and forget the inner posture that once made the ritual alive. And then something strange happens. The forgotten state begins to feel normal. A person who has never experienced silence may interpret silence as emptiness. A person who has never practiced attention may experience stillness as boredom. A person who has always measured worth through comparison may experience simplicity as failure. A person raised in constant stimulation may mistake agitation for aliveness. When enough people share the same distortion, it becomes culture. This is why the language of the Yugas can feel personal even if you do not read it as literal cosmic history. It asks a powerful question. What happens when an entire civilization normalizes conditions that make depth harder to perceive? The answer is not that depth disappears. It becomes hidden in plain sight. The Upanishads repeatedly move in this direction. They do not send the seeker toward a remote corner of the universe. They turn attention inward, toward Atman, toward the witnessing consciousness beneath the changing contents of experience. The sacred is described as nearer than the nearest, yet hidden from ordinary perception because the mind runs outward toward objects, desires, fears, and identities. That is a remarkable idea to place beside Kali Yuga. The age of maximum spiritual confusion does not need the divine to be physically far away. It only needs human attention to be constantly pointed somewhere else. The sun can be directly above you. If your eyes are fixed on the ground, you can walk all day without looking at it. This is why the old descriptions of decline often feel less like a story about punishment and more like a story about attention. Where does attention go? What claims it? What trains it? What weakens it? What becomes impossible to notice when every empty moment is immediately filled? These questions matter because Dharma is not merely a collection of rules. At its deepest level, Dharma is alignment, the right relationship between the individual and the whole, between desire and responsibility, between power and restraint, between human action and the living world, between the visible and the invisible, between what you want now and what will still matter when the excitement of now has passed. When Dharma weakens, relationships become transactional. Duties become burdens unless they produce reward. Knowledge becomes valuable only if it produces status or income. Nature becomes valuable only if it can be used. Other people become valuable only if they provide attention, advantage, or comfort. The world does not end when this happens. In some ways, the world can become extremely efficient. That is what makes the story uncomfortable. Kali Yuga can build impressive things. It can organize, accelerate, calculate, consume, advertise, and expand. It can place more information in the hand of one ordinary person than an ancient library could contain. It can connect distant continents instantly. It can map the human body, photograph distant galaxies, and build machines of astonishing precision. The tradition does not require us to deny any of that. The question is whether increased power automatically means increased wisdom. The ancient answer is no. Power without wisdom can deepen confusion because it gives confusion stronger tools. A jealous person with little power harms a small circle. A jealous ruler harms a nation. A distracted person with a quiet room loses an evening. A civilization built to monetize distraction can lose generations of attention. This is one reason the stories of the Yugas remain compelling. They do not assume that technological advancement and spiritual maturity move together. They may, but they do not have to. And if they do not, then the strangest possibility appears. A civilization can become more capable while becoming less certain what its capabilities are for. It can answer more questions while becoming less able to answer the question of purpose. What should a human being become? What is enough? What is worth sacrificing for? What does death reveal about the way we are living? What is consciousness? What is the difference between pleasure and fulfillment? What is sacred? These are not primitive questions. They are permanent questions. And an age that becomes unable to hold them may be advanced in one direction, while deeply undeveloped in another. The Puranic imagination gives this condition a cosmic frame. Dharma is sometimes pictured as a bull standing on 4 legs. In the age of truth, all 4 are strong. As the ages decline, the legs are reduced until Kali Yuga rests on one. The image is simple enough to remember, a world trying to maintain balance on diminishing support. But notice what the image does not say. The final leg is still there. Something remains. Kali Yuga is not the age in which Dharma becomes zero. It is the age in which Dharma becomes difficult, fragile, easily ignored, and therefore, in some teachings, unusually meaningful when consciously chosen. This produces one of the paradoxes at the center of the tradition. A dark age can also be an age of extraordinary spiritual opportunity. Why? Because what is easy is not tested in the same way as what is difficult. If everyone around you values restraint, restraint requires less courage. If everyone around you honors truth, truthfulness costs less. If the whole culture supports spiritual practice, practice does not have to fight for space in your life. But if the surrounding world rewards the opposite, a small act of alignment becomes more deliberate. To be content where endless appetite is cultivated is an act of strength. To remain inwardly quiet in an economy of attention is an act of strength. To refuse to turn every sacred thing into performance is an act of strength. To treat another person as a soul rather than an opportunity is an act of strength. The old stories do not ask you to hate the age you were born into. That would be another form of confusion. You did not choose the century of your birth. You did not choose the technologies, institutions, languages, and inherited assumptions that formed the world around you before you learned to speak. The task is not to resent the season. The task is to understand the season well enough to live consciously inside it. A sailor does not insult the storm. He learns what the storm changes. The direction of the wind matters. The height of the waves matters. The strength of the vessel matters. The amount of light matters. A map designed for calm water is not useless in a storm, but it must be read differently. In the same way, teachings preserved from earlier ages are not necessarily meant to be copied mechanically. The tradition itself adapts, practices are emphasized differently. The Bhagavata tradition famously places great importance on remembrance of the divine name in Kali Yuga, precisely because elaborate forms of practice can be difficult in an age of shortened attention, weakened discipline, and unstable conditions. The principle is compassionate. When the environment becomes harder, the door does not disappear. The door may become simpler. This is easy to miss if you imagine the divine as a ruler who withdraws in disgust. The deeper strands of the tradition tell a different story. Even when direct perception becomes rare, pathways remain, sound remains, memory remains, story remains, devotion remains, breath remains, the body remains, conscience remains, the capacity to turn attention remains, and so does longing. Longing may be one of the strangest gifts of a dark age. A person surrounded by abundance can still feel that something essential is missing. At first, the feeling is misread. Perhaps I need more money, more travel, more recognition, more romance, more entertainment, more achievement, more knowledge, more stimulation. The person moves from one answer to another. Some answers help, many do not. Eventually, a different possibility appears. What if the hunger is not for another object? What if the hunger is for a different quality of being? This is where the story of the gods becomes intimate. When people ask, when will the gods return? They usually imagine an external event, a figure in the sky, a divine army, a miraculous sign, a world suddenly transformed. But before we reach the prophecy of Kalki, the tradition forces us to confront something more difficult. Would a civilization trained to look only at surfaces recognize the sacred if it entered quietly? Would we recognize a teacher who did not advertise? Would we recognize wisdom that did not flatter us? Would we recognize a holy place without a sign announcing that it was holy? Would we recognize a divine presence that asked us to surrender vanity rather than confirm our importance? Perhaps the distance between humanity and the gods is not measured only in years. Perhaps it is measured in recognition. And if that is true, then the return does not begin when the gods move closer. It begins when human beings recover the capacity to see what was already near. This is the first key to the entire story. Kali Yuga is the age of forgetting. But the fact that a tradition can name forgetting means memory has not vanished completely. Somewhere, someone remembered enough to write it down. Someone protected the sound. Someone kept the story. Someone taught a child. Someone crossed a mountain with a manuscript. Someone repeated a mantra before dawn, while the rest of the village slept. Someone rebuilt a temple after it fell. Someone chose not to sell what was entrusted to them. Someone carried the thread. The thread became thin. It did not break, and that thin thread is what leads us to the next question. If Kali Yuga is an age inside a cycle, where exactly are we inside that cycle? Are we near its beginning? Are we near its end? Are we moving downward, upward, or simply standing in a place where different traditions have given different maps? To understand why people disagree so strongly about that question, we have to enter the mathematics of sacred time. Chapter 2. The Great Clock and the Argument about Time. Human beings are comfortable with time when it stays near the scale of a human life. A minute is easy. A year is familiar. A century is imaginable because we can connect it to grandparents, history books, buildings, and old photographs. But ancient Indian cosmology refuses to keep time at a comfortable scale. It expands time until individual lives become almost invisible inside it. Days of Brahma, nights of Brahma, Manvantaras, Mahayugas, cycles inside cycles, each one larger than the last, until the mind reaches the edge of what numbers can emotionally mean. In the standard Puranic calculation, the 4 yugas together form a Mahayuga of 4,320,000 human years. Satya Yuga lasts 1,728,000 years, Treta Yuga 1,296,000, Dvapara Yuga 864,000, and Kali Yuga 432,000. The proportions are 4, 3, 2 and 1. According to the traditional chronology widely used in Hindu astronomical and religious contexts, Kali Yuga began in 3102 BCE, associated with the departure of Krishna from the earthly realm. If that reckoning is taken literally, then only a little more than 5,000 years of a 432,000 year age have passed. That means the end is not close to us, not close to our children, not close to any civilization whose future we can reasonably picture. Hundreds of thousands of years would remain. This is the mainstream scale, And any serious discussion of Kali Yuga has to state it clearly because it is the calculation most deeply established in the classical Puranic system. But the story becomes more complicated because not every modern teacher accepted that scale in the same way. The best-known alternative comes from Sri Yukteswar Giri, the 19th century yogi and author of the Holy Science. He proposed a 24,000-year cycle related to an ascending and descending movement through the Yugas. In his system, humanity passed through the lowest point and entered an ascending Dvapara Yuga around the end of the 17th century. That interpretation produces a radically different picture. In the mainstream Puranic reading, humanity is still very early in Kali Yuga. In Sri Yukteswar's model, the deepest descent has already passed and human consciousness is moving upward through a new stage. These two maps cannot simply be blended into one without losing the differences between them. And this is where stories about Kali Yuga often become careless. They take the traditional 432,000 year number when it sounds mysterious, then quietly switch to a short cycle interpretation when they want to suggest that the end is happening now. That may make a more dramatic video, but it does not make a clearer argument, so tonight we will not do that. We will let the disagreement remain visible, because sometimes uncertainty is more spiritually useful than false certainty. The ancient world did not always treat sacred numbers the way a modern engineer treats measurements. Numbers could carry cosmological, ritual, and symbolic meaning at the same time. Repeating patterns such as 108, 432, and multiples of them appear across Indian religious thought. Scholars debate how these systems developed and how literally different passages were intended to be read. What matters for our story is that both long cycle and short cycle interpretations share one essential principle: the ages turn. The darkness is not the final state of reality. Even if the end of Kali Yuga lies hundreds of thousands of years away, the tradition still refuses to make darkness eternal. Even if Sri Yukteswar's shorter cycle is accepted, the upward movement is gradual, not an excuse for declaring that a golden age has already arrived. Both views destroy the same dangerous idea, that whatever is happening now must continue forever. Human beings are easily trapped by the present. We assume the world we know is the world itself. A person born during war can imagine war is permanent. A person born during prosperity can imagine prosperity is permanent. A person born into a particular political order can imagine that order is permanent. A person born into a particular technology can barely imagine daily life without it. But history is a graveyard of permanent things. Empires that believed they were eternal are archaeological sites. Languages that once filled markets and palaces survive in inscriptions. Trade routes move, rivers move, coastlines move, religions change form, kingdoms become place names, sacred centers rise, fall, vanish, and return. The Yuga system takes that lesson and magnifies it beyond ordinary history. It says even the moral and spiritual atmosphere of the world is not fixed. Consciousness has seasons. Whether you read that cosmologically or symbolically, the idea is powerful. The difficulty of an age is real, but it is not absolute. A winter field looks dead to someone who does not know spring. The seed does not need the field to look alive before it begins preparing to rise. This is where the concept of transition becomes important. Indian traditions often use the idea of sandhya, a junction or twilight. The word can refer to the transition between night and day, to ritual times such as dawn and dusk, and in cosmological contexts to transitional periods around the Yugas. Twilight is a perfect image because it contains ambiguity. At dawn, darkness and light occupy the same sky. One person looks east and says morning is coming. Another looks west and says it is still night. Both are describing something true from where they stand. This may explain why every generation living through rapid change feels confused about whether the world is improving or collapsing. Some things improve, while others deteriorate. Medicine advances while loneliness deepens. Information becomes more available while attention becomes more fragmented. People gain freedoms their ancestors lacked while becoming dependent on systems their ancestors never needed. Ancient knowledge becomes globally accessible while being stripped of context, repackaged, simplified, and sold. A person can encounter the Bhagavad Gita on a phone in a village thousands of miles from India. That is extraordinary. The same phone can prevent that person from reading 5 uninterrupted pages. Which age does that belong to? Decline or awakening? The answer may be both. That is the nature of a threshold. The old and the new do not take turns politely. They overlap. A forest does not become spring because one flower opens, but the flower matters. Winter does not disappear the first morning. A bird changes its song, but the song matters. A civilization does not become wise because more people become interested in meditation, but the interest may still tell us something about what the civilization is hungry for. This is where we have to resist another temptation. Spiritual longing does not automatically prove that an age is ending. People in every century have felt that they were living at the edge of history. Apocalyptic expectation is one of humanity's oldest habits. Wars, plagues, eclipses, political collapse, new technologies, and social change have repeatedly convinced people that the final turning must be near. Most of them were wrong about their date. The world continued. That fact should make us humble. If someone claims to know the exact year Kalki will appear, the burden of proof is enormous. The classical texts give symbolic and narrative details, but they do not provide a modern countdown clock that can be verified like a train schedule. Later calculations vary, sectarian predictions vary. Internet prophecies multiply faster than scholarship can correct them. So the wisest way to approach the question is not to ask, can we force the tradition to give us a date that makes our lifetime feel cosmically special? The wiser question is, what kind of human being does the tradition ask us to become regardless of the date? Because if Kali Yuga ends tomorrow, Dharma matters. If Kali Yuga ends in 400,000 years, Dharma still matters. If the Yugas are literal cosmic periods, Dharma matters. If you read them as a spiritual map of recurring human conditions, Dharma still matters. The calendar changes the scale of the story. It does not change the work. This may be why the Bhagavad Gita remains so central. Krishna does not teach Arjuna to wait for a better age before acting rightly. Arjuna stands inside confusion, grief, and moral complexity. The teaching begins there. Do the work that is yours. Act without surrendering your mind to the fruit of action. See beyond the small self that believes it controls the whole field. Remember what does not die when forms change. The Gita does not promise a simple world. It teaches a way to stand inside a difficult one. That is a Kali Yuga teaching even when the text itself belongs to the great transition surrounding the Mahabharata, and perhaps this is the real reason the Yuga timeline fascinates us. We do not only want to know what time it is, we want to know whether our struggle has a meaning. If the world is becoming more confused, we want to know whether confusion is winning. If sacred traditions are weakening, we want to know whether something can survive. If human beings seem increasingly distracted, we want to know whether attention can recover. If the gods seem absent, we want to know whether absence is final. The great clock answers with a strange kind of reassurance. Nothing in the cycle is final except the turning itself. Satya Yuga does not remain forever. Kali Yuga does not remain forever. Every height descends. Every descent eventually reaches its limit. Every ending becomes a condition for another beginning. But the wheel is not sentimental. It does not turn because we are tired of the age. It does not accelerate because our generation wants to witness a cosmic event. Sacred time is not organized around human impatience. It is difficult to accept because modern life trains us to expect immediate feedback. We press a button and the result appears. We send a message and watch for the reply. We order something and track its movement. We measure progress daily, hourly, sometimes minute by minute. But the Yugas ask the mind to imagine a scale at which entire civilizations are only moments. On that scale, your task is not to control the wheel. Your task is to know how to stand on it. This is why the long chronology can be spiritually useful even if it feels disappointing. It removes the fantasy that history will rescue us quickly. If Kali Yuga has hundreds of thousands of years remaining, then you cannot outsource your life to the coming golden age. You have to practice now. You have to become truthful now. You have to protect attention now. You have to remember now. And if the shorter chronology is correct, the conclusion is strangely similar. An ascending age does not remove your responsibility. It increases it. If conditions are becoming more favorable to expanded awareness, then wasting that opening through distraction would be its own kind of tragedy. Either way, waiting passively makes no sense. This is an important correction to the popular fantasy of divine return. People often imagine the return of the gods as a rescue operation. Humanity becomes sufficiently lost, heaven intervenes, the wrong people are removed, the right people are rewarded, and the world is repaired from above. But the Hindu imagination is usually more complex than that. Avatars restore Dharma, but human beings still have choices. Krishna stands beside Arjuna, but Arjuna must lift the bow. Rama embodies Dharma, but an entire web of beings participates in the restoration around him. The divine enters history, but history does not become a puppet show. Kalki follows the same pattern. To understand what Kalki means, however, we first have to understand what kind of world the tradition imagines at the extreme end of Kali Yuga, and that is where the old descriptions become startling. Not because they secretly contain smartphones, satellites, or modern political parties. They do not. They become startling because the human tendencies they describe are recognizable. Wealth replacing character, appearance replacing substance, authority separating from virtue, short memory, shortened patience, weak trust, broken obligations, sacred language used without sacred understanding, the body becoming the center of identity, desire becoming difficult to satisfy because satisfaction itself produces new desire. These patterns can appear in many times and places. The question is what happens when they become normal enough that people stop seeing them as patterns at all. That is the world we enter next. Chapter 3. The signs of an age reaching its limit. There is a way of reading old prophecies that makes them useless. You take a line written in an ancient world, remove it from its setting, search the present for anything that resembles it, and then declare that the prediction has come true. If a text says rulers become unjust, every corrupt politician becomes proof. If it says families weaken, every divorce becomes proof. If it says people become greedy, every luxury advertisement becomes proof. That kind of reading creates excitement, but very little understanding. Human beings have always been greedy. Rulers have always failed. Families have always struggled. Markets have always tempted. Teachers have always included frauds. If prophecy means only finding an old sentence that can be attached to a modern problem, then almost any age can be made to look like the final age. The Puranic descriptions of Kali Yuga deserve better than that. They become more interesting when we stop treating them as a secret newspaper about the 21st century and begin treating them as a portrait of what happens when Dharma loses cultural support. The Bhagavata Purana, Vishnu Purana, and other texts contain passages describing deteriorating social, moral, and spiritual conditions in Kali Yuga. Different translations emphasize different details, and later retellings often mix them together. But several themes recur strongly enough that we can recognize the shape of the warning. The first is the replacement of inner quality by outer measure. In a healthy moral order, wealth is one part of life. It can support family, charity, learning, ritual, art, security, and service. The problem begins when wealth becomes the main proof of worth. Then a strange inversion appears. A person is no longer respected because he is disciplined, generous, truthful, or wise. Those qualities are appreciated only if they produce visible success. Money stops being a tool and becomes a moral certificate. The rich person is assumed to be intelligent. The famous person is assumed to be important. The powerful person is assumed to deserve power. The person without public success must explain himself. This is not only an economic problem. It is a problem of perception. A society always teaches its children what to notice. If every image of success is attached to possession, the child learns before anyone gives a lecture. If the admired life is always the most visible life, invisibility begins to feel like failure. If the winner is the person who acquires more, then enough becomes difficult to define. Kali Yuga is full of things that cannot say enough. Desire does not naturally contain its own ending. It needs a boundary from somewhere deeper. You can always earn more. You can always improve the house. You can always find a better device. You can always gain more followers. You can always optimize the body further. You can always acquire another experience that proves you are living fully. There is no final object that tells desire, you may now rest. That message has to come from wisdom. When wisdom weakens, desire becomes a wheel inside the larger wheel. The second recurring sign is the weakening of truth. This does not mean everyone begins lying all the time. A society could not function if language became completely meaningless. The deeper decline happens when truth becomes negotiable whenever it interferes with advantage. A person speaks one way to gain approval and another way to gain power. Institutions describe failure as success because reputation must be protected. People repeat claims they have not examined because the claims support their side. Silence becomes rare because admitting I do not know feels weaker than offering an immediate opinion. Eventually, the problem is not simply that falsehood exists. Falsehood has always existed. The problem is that people lose the habit of caring whether something is true before using it. That is a more serious collapse. Ali at least recognizes truth as an obstacle. The liar knows what happened and chooses to conceal it. But when a culture becomes indifferent to truth, the distinction itself begins to weaken. What matters is whether a statement works. Does it attract? Does it persuade? Does it defend the group? Does it wound the enemy? Does it produce attention? Truth becomes secondary to effect, and once effect becomes the main measure of speech, noise multiplies faster than understanding. This brings us to another major theme of Kali Yuga, the confusion of information with knowledge. The ancient texts did not describe digital networks. We should not pretend they did. But they understood that knowledge is more than accumulation. A person can remember 10,000 facts and remain foolish about his own anger. A person can explain philosophy and still be unable to apologize. A person can quote scripture and still use every quotation to protect his ego. A person can know the technical language of meditation and never sit still long enough to meet his own mind. Knowledge becomes wisdom only when it changes perception and conduct. This is one reason the guru-shishya relationship was traditionally treated with such seriousness. The student was not merely collecting ideas, he was being formed. The teacher was not merely transferring data. Ideally, the teacher embodied a way of seeing, and the student entered a discipline designed to test whether that seeing had become real. Of course, historical teachers were human. Traditions contain abuse, hypocrisy, hierarchy, and failure like every human institution. Romanticizing the past is another form of blindness, but the ideal itself contains something modern systems often lose. Knowledge is supposed to transform the knower. When that principle disappears, spiritual teaching can become entertainment. A person listens to a powerful talk, feels elevated for 20 minutes, then returns unchanged to the same habits. The next day, another talk is needed, then another. The teaching becomes a mood, the listener becomes a consumer, the sacred becomes content, and the most dangerous part is that both teacher and audience may believe something spiritual is happening, because spiritual language is present. This is exactly how shells survive after the center weakens. Another traditional sign concerns authority. The old ideal of kingship was never merely administrative. A ruler was bound to dharma. Power had duties. The king existed within an order larger than himself. He could violate that order, certainly, and history contains many rulers who did. But the ideal remained available as a standard by which failure could be named. Kali Yuga is the condition in which power increasingly treats itself as the standard. The question changes from, is this right? To, can I do this? From, what do I owe? To, what can I take? From, what protects the whole? To, what protects my position? This pattern appears not only in government, it appears wherever power exists. A parent can use power selfishly, a teacher can use power selfishly, a religious leader can use power selfishly, a wealthy person can use power selfishly, a majority can use power selfishly, a victim can gain power and use it selfishly. Kali Yuga is not a political party, it is not a nationality, it is not a race, class, or generation. It is a condition in which the gravitational pull of ego becomes harder to resist. That is why turning prophecy into a weapon against people you dislike defeats the entire point. If your reading of Kali Yuga always proves that your enemies are corrupt and your group is righteous, you are probably reading your ego, not the text. The old stories are mirrors before they are weapons. What have I made more important than truth? Where do I perform virtue instead of practicing it? Where have I confused visibility with value? Where do I use spiritual language to avoid spiritual work? Where do I demand from others what I excuse in myself? These questions are harder than naming the age, and therefore they are more useful. Another theme in the Puranic descriptions is the weakening of family and generational bonds. Again, this should not be simplified into nostalgia. Not every old family structure was healthy. Tradition can protect wisdom, but it can also preserve injustice. Respect for elders does not mean surrendering judgment. Obedience is not always virtue. Ancient societies had their own forms of cruelty and exclusion. The deeper point is continuity. Human beings need a relationship with time larger than their own lifetime. A child enters a world already in progress. Language, stories, customs, skills, memories, duties, and unfinished promises existed before the child arrived. To grow up without any sense of inheritance is to imagine that reality begins with the self. That is a dangerous illusion. When generations stop speaking meaningfully to one another, knowledge becomes shallow even when information becomes abundant. The young lose the memory of consequences. The old lose contact with changing conditions. Both sides become caricatures to the other. The ancient person becomes backward. The young person becomes disrespectful. No one listens long enough to discover what the other actually knows. A culture without memory becomes easy to manipulate because every new idea can present itself as unprecedented, and every old mistake can return wearing new clothes. This is why ancestor traditions, family stories, and inherited practices mattered so deeply across ancient civilizations. They placed the individual inside a chain. You received something. You are responsible for what you do with it. You will leave something. That simple structure protects against the fantasy that life belongs only to the present self. Kali Yuga weakens chains. Not every chain deserves preservation. But when every chain is broken, the individual becomes strangely free and strangely alone. Freedom without belonging can become weight. You are told to invent yourself completely. Choose your identity. Choose your values. Choose your purpose. Choose your community. Choose what counts as truth. Choose what counts as success. At first this sounds empowering. Then the hidden burden appears. If you must create yourself from nothing, every uncertainty feels like personal failure. Tradition, at its best, does not eliminate freedom. It gives freedom a starting place. It says you were born into a conversation. Learn the conversation before deciding what to continue, reform or refuse. Another sign frequently associated with Kali Yuga is the reduction of spiritual authority to appearance. Clothing can be copied. Vocabulary can be copied. Ceremony can be copied. Confidence can be copied. Mystery can be performed. Humility is harder to copy because real humility eventually costs the ego something. Service is harder to copy because service becomes inconvenient. Integrity is harder to copy because it has to survive unseen moments. This is why false teachers flourish wherever audiences are trained to judge spirituality through surface signals. The problem is not that people seek teachers. The problem is that seekers may prefer certainty to truth. A teacher who says, "I do not know," may appear less impressive than one who gives a cosmic explanation for everything. A teacher who tells you that transformation will take years may appear less attractive than one who promises awakening quickly. A teacher who refuses to flatter your sense of specialness may lose to one who tells you that you are chosen, awakened, unusually sensitive, or part of a secret group destined to transform the planet. Kali Yuga does not only produce false teachers, it produces the appetite that makes false teaching profitable. That distinction matters. Fraud survives because something in the audience wants the fraud to be true. We want shortcuts. We want certainty. We want to be important. We want ancient mysteries to confirm our modern desires. We want the divine to agree with us. A real spiritual path is often disappointing to those desires. It may ask you to become less dramatic, not more responsible, not more special. More patient, not more certain, more honest about your motives, not more fascinated by your destiny. This is why the deepest signs of Kali Yuga are not spectacular. They are ordinary distortions repeated until they become an atmosphere. Another such distortion concerns the body. The body is sacred in many Hindu traditions. Yoga would make little sense otherwise. The body is a vehicle, a field of practice, a microcosm, a temple. It is not something to despise, but reverence for the body is different from identification with appearance. The Kali Yuga problem is not caring for the body. It is forgetting that the body changes while awareness experiences the change. Youth becomes identity. Beauty becomes currency. Age becomes embarrassment. Health becomes moral superiority. Death becomes something hidden from daily life until it arrives as an unacceptable interruption. A culture can become obsessed with maintaining the vessel while barely asking what the voyage is for. The Bhagavad Gita begins its deepest teaching by confronting death and identity directly. Bodies change. The embodied self passes through childhood, youth, and old age. The wise are not confused by the transition in the same way because they do not reduce the whole person to the passing form. You do not need to accept every metaphysical claim of the Gita to understand the psychological power of that teaching. If all worth rests on a changing form, time becomes an enemy. Every wrinkle is a loss. Every illness is an insult. Every younger person is a reminder. But if the body is honored without being mistaken for the whole self, aging becomes something different. Still difficult, still physical, still capable of pain and grief, but not the destruction of all meaning. Kali Yuga magnifies identification, not only with the body, with opinions, with groups, with wounds, with roles, with possessions, with stories about who we are. The more tightly identity is held, the more threatening difference becomes. A disagreement feels like an attack, a correction feels like humiliation, a loss feels like annihilation, a change of mind feels like betrayal of the self. This produces conflict even among people who believe they are defending truth. That is another paradox of a confused age. Everyone can become certain that clarity belongs to them. The loudest person is not necessarily the most confused. The quietest person is not necessarily wise. There is no simple visual marker. That is why discrimination, viveka, becomes essential. Viveka is the capacity to distinguish permanent from impermanent, self from not self, truth from appearance, need from desire, signal from noise. And this brings us directly toward Kalki, because the sword associated with Kalki can be understood through this ancient language of discrimination. But before we ride toward the white horse, there are several more signs worth understanding, because they reveal why a figure of radical discrimination belongs at the end of this age. One is the weakening of patience. Patience sounds like a small virtue until a civilization loses it. Without patience, no difficult skill develops. Without patience, relationships become disposable. Without patience, grief is medicated before it is understood. Without patience, prayer becomes a transaction. Without patience, learning becomes summary. Without patience, disagreement becomes rage because there is no willingness to remain in uncertainty long enough for a deeper answer to emerge. The faster a culture moves, the more patience begins to feel unnatural. But reality does not obey the speed of culture. A child still takes years to grow. Trust still takes time. A tree still needs seasons. A broken heart still has its own rhythm. Wisdom still resists shortcuts. The mind may consume 1,000 explanations in a day, but understanding cannot always be accelerated. This is one reason ancient practices seem frustrating to modern attention. Repetition, silence, daily discipline, returning to the same verse, sitting with the same question, breathing, watching, waiting. Nothing dramatic may happen for a long time. The ego hates this because the ego wants proof of progress, but some things deepen precisely because they are not constantly measured. Another sign is the commercialization of everything. Again, trade itself is not the problem. Hindu civilization has always included merchants, markets, and wealth. Artha, material prosperity, is one of the recognized aims of life when pursued within Dharma. The distortion begins when every value becomes market value. What is a forest worth? What is a river worth? What is attention worth? What is a person's face worth? What is privacy worth? What is a sacred teaching worth? What is a funeral worth? What is loneliness worth if it can be turned into a subscription? Once the market learns to enter every human need, it becomes difficult to distinguish what satisfies the need from what monetizes the need. Spiritual hunger is especially vulnerable. A person feels empty. Someone sells belonging. A person feels uncertain. Someone sells certainty. A person feels ordinary. Someone sells a secret identity. A person fears death. Someone sells a guarantee about what comes after. A person wants transformation. Someone sells a weakened version of it. The marketplace is not evil, but hunger requires discernment. If you do not understand the hunger, you can spend a lifetime buying substitutes. This is perhaps the central tragedy of Kali Yuga. The age is not empty of answers. It is crowded with answers. So crowded that the real question becomes difficult to hear. The final sign we should consider is environmental disorder. Ancient Indian thought often places human life inside a reciprocal relationship with the natural world. Rain, agriculture, ritual, moral order, and social responsibility are linked in ways that modern categories separate. The Bhagavad Gita itself describes a cycle in which beings depend on food. Food depends on rain. Rain is linked with sacrificial action, and action with cosmic order. We do not need to turn this into a simplistic claim that moral behavior controls weather. The ancient worldview is more integrated than modern cause and effect language. The point is relationship. Human beings do not stand outside nature. When a culture forgets this, it treats the earth as background material for human desire. Forests become inventory. Rivers become channels. Animals become units. Soil becomes a medium for extraction. The consequences eventually return because the boundary between human economy and natural ecology was never real. You can ignore relationship. You cannot escape it. That sentence could summarize much of Dharma. Kali Yuga is the age in which relationship is forgotten and consequence arrives later. The relation between action and character, between consumption and environment, between speech and trust, between desire and restlessness, between loneliness and the destruction of community, between constant stimulation and the inability to be still, between power and responsibility, between truth and social order. The delay between action and consequence allows illusion to grow. A person can live for years believing the debt will never be collected. Then the bill arrives all at once. This is why endings often feel sudden, even when they were prepared slowly. A tree falls in 1 second after years of decay. A relationship ends in one conversation after years of silence. An empire collapses in a decade after centuries of weakening. A person changes in a moment after a long period in which nothing appeared to be changing. The visible break is not the whole event. It is the moment hidden accumulation becomes visible. This is important for understanding the end of Kali Yuga. People imagine an ending because they want a dramatic final event. But the tradition invites us to look at accumulation. What has been weakening? What has been preserved? What has become unbearable? What has become impossible to pretend not to see? Because a system can continue only while enough people believe in its assumptions. When the assumptions themselves become visible, change begins at a deeper level. This is why maximum confusion can contain the seed of clarity, not because darkness magically produces light, because contradiction eventually becomes difficult to hide. If a society says wealth will make you fulfilled and the wealthy remain restless, the promise weakens. If endless connection produces loneliness, the contradiction becomes visible. If more information produces less shared reality, the contradiction becomes visible. If constant self-expression produces uncertainty about identity, the contradiction becomes visible. If spiritual products multiply while genuine transformation remains rare, the contradiction becomes visible. At first, people respond by demanding more of the same: more consumption, more stimulation, more optimization, more certainty, more content, more identity, more argument. Then a smaller group begins asking a different question. What if the problem is not that we do not have enough? What if we have forgotten how to recognize enough? That question is a crack in the age, not proof that Kali Yuga is ending tomorrow. A crack. A place where another kind of seeing becomes possible, and traditions often begin through such small openings. A single person becomes dissatisfied with the dominant answer. He goes into the forest. She sits beside a river. A student seeks a teacher. A teacher refuses the easy answer. A family keeps a ritual alive. A village protects a grove. A monk preserves a manuscript. A musician keeps a raga whose meaning the court has forgotten. A grandmother teaches a child the name of God. None of these looks like the end of an age, but Dharma rarely survives through spectacle. It survives through continuity. This is the part apocalyptic imagination tends to miss. We look for thunder and ignore the seed. We look for a divine army and ignore the person who chooses truth when lying would be easier. We look for cosmic signs and ignore the recovery of attention. We ask when the gods return, while forgetting the countless ways traditions say the divine remains available in the present. Still, Hindu tradition does contain a dramatic figure associated with the end of Kali Yuga. His name is Kalki, and no image connected with the final age has been more misunderstood, sensationalized, or detached from its symbolic depth than the rider on the white horse. Before we reach him, remember the world he enters, a world where measures have replaced meaning, where truth has become negotiable, where authority has detached from responsibility, where knowledge has detached from transformation, where desire has detached from enough, where identity has detached from the deeper self, where human life has detached from nature, where sacred language can remain while sacred perception grows weak. What kind of figure belongs at the end of such an age? Not merely a stronger ruler, not merely a better institution, not merely another philosophy added to the pile. The age already has too many appearances. What it lacks is the power to distinguish appearance from reality. And that is why the sword matters. Chapter 4. Kalki, the white horse, and the sword of clarity. The image is unforgettable. A rider appears at the end of Kali Yuga. He is associated with Vishnu, the sustaining principle that repeatedly enters the world when Dharma declines. He rides a white horse. He carries a blazing sword. The corrupt order of the age is broken. Dharma is restored, and the cycle opens toward renewal. Even people who know little about Hindu cosmology have encountered some version of the image, but images this powerful are dangerous when separated from context. They become whatever the viewer wants them to be. A political fantasy, a revenge fantasy, a promise that enemies will be destroyed, a prediction about a specific modern leader, a countdown to catastrophe, an excuse to imagine that divine violence will solve human problems without requiring human transformation. The traditional figure of Kalki is larger and more difficult than those uses. Kalki is generally described as the 10th avatar of Vishnu, following the better-known avatars such as Rama and Krishna. The Vishnu Purana and Bhagavata Purana contain important references to him, while the later Kalki Purana elaborates the story in much greater narrative detail. Traditional accounts associate his birth with Shambhala, in the family of a Brahmin named Vishnu Yasha. He appears when rulers have become little more than thieves, and the condition of Dharma has reached extreme decline. He destroys the forces sustaining a dharma and prepares the renewal of a more truthful age. We should be careful here. The texts contain violent imagery. It would be dishonest to pretend the sword is only a peaceful metaphor. Apocalyptic literature often expresses restoration through the defeat of destructive forces, and the Kalki tradition is no exception. But symbolic interpretation has always existed alongside literal narrative in Hindu traditions. A sword can cut bodies in a story. It can also cut ignorance in philosophy. The two levels do not cancel each other. Myth works precisely because it can carry more than one layer at once, and the symbolic layer matters especially for a listener asking what the story means now. What is a sword? A sword separates. Before the cut, two things seem joined. After the cut, the boundary is clear. This is why the sword appears across spiritual traditions as a symbol of discernment. Wisdom divides truth from falsehood, permanent from temporary, essential from accidental. Kalki enters an age whose defining problem is confusion. So the weapon that fits the age is discrimination, not endless additional information, clarity. Think about the difference. When you are lost because you lack information, more information helps. When you are lost because you cannot distinguish reliable information from noise, more information can make the problem worse. Kali Yuga is not starving for messages, it is drowning in messages. The sword is the ability to cut through them. What matters, what does not, what is true, what is merely repeated, what is sacred, what is costume, what is need, what is appetite, what is love, what is possession wearing the name of love, what is humility, what is weakness pretending to be humility, what is courage, what is aggression pretending to be courage. What is tradition? What is fear of change pretending to be tradition? What is progress? What is appetite pretending to be progress? The sword does not give easy answers. It demands the capacity to see distinctions the age prefers to blur. This is why Kalki should not be reduced to destruction. The deeper terror of clarity is that it removes the excuses that confusion protects. A person can remain trapped for years while believing he does not know what is wrong. Then one moment of unmistakable clarity arrives. The relationship is dead. The addiction is controlling the life. The ambition is empty. The resentment has become identity. The spiritual practice is performance. The teacher is manipulating the student. The career has become a prison built from approval. Nothing external may change in that exact second, but the old world is already ending because it can no longer be believed in the same way. That is what a sword of clarity does. It makes return impossible. Once you see the rope is not a snake, fear cannot recreate the snake with the same power. Once you recognize a lie as a lie, you may continue living inside the system built around it, but the inner relationship has changed. The outer change may take years. The cut happened instantly. This gives us one powerful way to understand Kalki at the level of consciousness. The final avatar represents a quality of seeing that the final age can no longer absorb without changing. The white horse deepens the image. Horses in Vedic and later Indian symbolism are connected with power, movement, vitality, kingship, and the sun. The Ashivena ritual placed the horse within a complex royal and cosmic framework. The horse is energy that moves. White, across many traditions, carries associations of purity, illumination, and visibility. A white horse at the end of a dark age is not subtle imagery. Something is moving that darkness cannot disguise. But notice another detail. A horse must be directed. Power without direction becomes danger. This returns us to the relationship between energy and dharma. Kali Yuga is not necessarily weak. It can be enormously energetic. Its problem is direction. Human beings become capable of doing more before becoming clear about what should be done. Kalki joins power to discrimination. The horse moves, the rider sees, the sword distinguishes. Together they form an image of action aligned with clarity that is almost the opposite of the restless activity of Kali Yuga. The dark age moves constantly because it cannot rest. Kalki moves because direction is clear. One is agitation, the other is purpose. The distinction is important. Many people mistake movement for progress because standing still feels uncomfortable. A society can change rapidly without knowing where it is going. A person can fill every hour without knowing why he is busy. Kalki is not simply more speed. He is decisive direction after an age of confused motion. The place name Shambhala has also gathered layers of interpretation. In the Hindu Kalki narrative, Shambhala is associated with Kalki's birth. In Tibetan Buddhist Kalachakra tradition, Shambhala develops into a rich and distinct sacred geography with its own kings and prophetic cycle. Later, Western esoteric movements blended and transformed these traditions further. It is important not to collapse all of them into one secret Himalayan kingdom as if every source tells the same story. They do not. But the shared imaginative power of Shambhala is revealing. Human beings repeatedly imagine that when the visible world becomes corrupt, something essential is preserved somewhere beyond the reach of corruption. A hidden valley, a remote monastery, a lineage, a manuscript, a cave, a family, a memory, an inner chamber of consciousness. Somewhere the seed remains clean enough to begin again. This is not only religious fantasy, it expresses a real principle of cultural survival. Traditions often survive at the margins. When courts collapse, villages remember songs. When languages disappear from official use, families keep speaking them at home. When institutions become corrupt, small communities preserve the original discipline. When books are destroyed, memorized verses survive in human bodies. When public religion becomes spectacle, private devotion can remain sincere. The sacred may become less visible without becoming extinct. This is one reason hiddenness is such a powerful theme in Kali Yuga. What is visible is not always what is alive. A giant institution can be spiritually empty. A single unknown practitioner can carry a living tradition. A celebrated teacher can have no depth. A quiet grandmother can transmit devotion more effectively than 1,000 speeches. The age trains us to measure importance through scale. The sacred often ignores scale. A seed is small. So is a flame, so is a syllable, so is the first honest thought that ends years of self-deception. The Kalki story also carries a relationship with Parashurama in later tradition. The immortal warrior sage is sometimes described as becoming Kalki's teacher, transmitting martial and sacred knowledge. Whether one reads this literally, mythically, or symbolically, the structure is beautiful. The future receives instruction from something ancient that never died. The new age does not appear from nothing. It is initiated by preserved memory. This is a recurring pattern in Hindu thought. Creation is not absolute novelty. It is re-emergence. The Vedas are heard again. Dharma is restored. Forms change, but truth is not invented by the generation that rediscovers it. This cuts against one of the strongest habits of modern culture. The belief that new automatically means better and old automatically means obsolete. The Kalki pattern says renewal may require recovering what was forgotten rather than inventing what never existed. Not copying the past mechanically. Recovering principle. Dharma is not antique furniture to be placed exactly where it stood centuries ago. It is order that must become alive under new conditions. If the world changes, application changes, truthfulness remains truthfulness, but the forms of deception change. Self-restraint remains self-restraint, but the objects of temptation change. Compassion remains compassion, but the systems through which harm occurs change. Attention remains attention, but the forces competing for it change. The sword of discrimination must therefore be sharp enough to separate principle from form. This is where fundamentalism and forgetfulness become strange twins. Forgetfulness throws away the old because it is old. Fundamentalism preserves the old because it is old. Dharma asks a harder question. What is the living principle here? What is eternal and what belonged to a particular place, century, social structure, or technology? That question requires more intelligence than either blind rejection or blind preservation. Kalki is a fitting figure for that difficulty because the end of an age is not a museum restoration. Satya Yuga does not mean everyone simply returns to the clothing, farming methods, political systems, and household customs of ancient India. A renewed age would be renewed at the level of consciousness and dharma. The forms through which that consciousness expresses itself could be completely different. This matters because romanticizing the past is one of the easiest ways to avoid transforming the present. You can spend years imagining a perfect ancient world while remaining impatient, vain, and dishonest in your modern one. That is not dharma, that is nostalgia. Kalki is not nostalgia. The rider moves forward. Another misunderstanding concerns the idea of destruction. When people are wounded by the world, apocalyptic stories can become emotionally satisfying. The corrupt will finally be punished. The arrogant will finally kneel. The hidden righteous will finally be recognized. Everything unfair will be reversed. There is a human need inside that fantasy, the need for moral order. We want wrongdoing to matter. We want goodness not to be foolish. We want history to have an answer to cruelty. But revenge is not the same as restoration. If you imagine Kalki mainly as the divine weapon that destroys everyone you resent, then Kali Yuga has entered the prophecy through you. The ego has simply dressed itself in sacred imagery. The harder reading is this: what in me cannot survive a return of clarity? What would the sword cut first if it entered my life? My enemies, or my excuses? My rivals, or my vanity? The people I judge, or the pleasure I take in judging them? A true restoration of Dharma would not flatter every part of the person who desires restoration. Some parts would have to end. This is why spiritual rebirth is often described through death imagery. The false center cannot remain untouched while claiming to enter a new order. If Kali Yuga is partly an age of misidentification, then the end of Kali Yuga must involve the death of misidentification. That can be painful. A false self may be familiar even when it causes suffering. People remain in known misery because unknown freedom is frightening. An age can do the same. Systems defend themselves. Institutions protect their stories. Individuals protect identities built inside those systems. When change becomes unavoidable, resistance often intensifies. This is one reason endings can look more chaotic before they look clear. Not because every crisis proves a golden age is near, but because structures under pressure reveal what they were built to protect. A calm institution can speak beautifully about principle. A threatened institution shows what it actually serves. A calm person can speak beautifully about detachment. A threatened person discovers how detached he really is. Pressure reveals allegiance. Kalki is ultimate pressure in mythic form. The age can no longer hide from what it has become. This brings us to another part of the prophecy: restoration. The goal is not permanent apocalypse. Kalki is not the god of endless ruins. The destructive phase exists because a new condition of Dharma must become possible. This distinguishes cyclical apocalypse from pure annihilation. The world is not simply discarded. The field is cleared. Seeds remain. Rain returns. Order is renewed. A new Satya Yuga begins in the traditional cycle. This is the great contrast with modern fantasies of collapse, which often stop at destruction because destruction is visually dramatic. Ancient cyclical cosmology asks the more difficult question: what comes after the ruins? Can human beings live differently? Can memory be restored? Can power return to responsibility? Can knowledge return to wisdom? Can desire return to proportion? Can nature return to relationship? Can sacredness return to ordinary life? A golden age is not merely a world with fewer problems. It is a world organized around a different center. This is why the return of the gods cannot be understood as celebrity arrival. If Vishnu descended and human consciousness remained completely unchanged, the old patterns would rebuild themselves around a new event. People would compete for access. Institutions would form. Status would attach itself to proximity. Merchandise would appear. Arguments would begin over who understood the avatar correctly. The Kali Yuga mind could turn even the end of Kali Yuga into content. That sounds humorous, but the point is serious. External revelation does not automatically create inner readiness. The Bhagavad Gita places Krishna directly in front of Arjuna, and even then teaching is required. Seeing the divine form does not eliminate the need for understanding. The human instrument must be prepared to receive what is revealed. So what would readiness look like? Not perfection. The stories rarely demand perfection before grace appears. Readiness looks more like exhaustion with illusion, the moment when substitutes have lost their charm. The moment when the person no longer wants a spiritual experience merely to decorate the ego. The moment when truth becomes more valuable than comfort. The moment when the seeker is willing to lose an identity in order to see. That is a frightening threshold. And it is the threshold Kalki represents. The name itself is often connected in popular explanation with the end or destroyer of Kali. Though Sanskrit etymologies and textual interpretations are more complicated than simple slogan translations suggest, what matters in the narrative is clear. Kalki belongs to the completion of the Dark Age. He is not simply another teacher appearing inside Kali Yuga to make it slightly better. He marks a break, a boundary, a before and after. That is why the image continues to fascinate. Human beings sense that some problems cannot be solved by endless adjustment. A lie does not always need improvement. Sometimes it needs to end. An addiction does not always need better management. Sometimes the relationship to the substance must break. A corrupt system does not always need another policy. Sometimes its founding assumption has to be questioned. A spiritual identity does not always need another teaching. Sometimes the identity that collects teachings has to be seen through. The sword is radical because it interrupts negotiation with what cannot be repaired in its present form. That is not a comfortable message. People usually prefer transformation that preserves everything they like about themselves. Kalki represents transformation with no obligation to protect illusion. Yet the horse is white. The movement is toward clarity, not darkness. And that tells us something about the emotional tone of the prophecy. It is terrifying only from the perspective of what cannot continue, from the perspective of what has been buried. It is release. Imagine a room sealed for generations. The windows have been painted over. Dust covers every object. People born inside the room have constructed philosophies explaining why fresh air is impossible. Then someone breaks the window. The first sensation is violent. Glass falls, wind enters, dust rises, eyes water. The room becomes chaotic. For a moment, the opening looks like destruction. Then everyone breathes differently. The event did not create the sky. It removed what blocked the sky. This may be one of the most useful ways to understand Kalki, not as the creator of truth, as the remover of what makes truth impossible to ignore. The avatar restores Dharma because Dharma is more fundamental than the disorder covering it. The sword does not invent reality. It cuts the veil. And when the veil is cut, the question changes. We are no longer asking only, who is coming? We begin asking, what would it feel like for the veil to thin? Would the transition happen everywhere at once? Would people recognize it immediately? Would the world become peaceful overnight? Would nature change? Would human consciousness change first? Would there be a twilight in which the old age and the new overlap? The traditions offer no single modern scientific description of such a transition, but their images of junction, renewal, restored Dharma, and changing human quality allow us to imagine something more subtle than a single cinematic event. The end of a night begins before sunrise is visible, and that is where our story goes next. Chapter 5. The Twilight Between Ages. Dawn is not a switch. That is easy to forget, because we name the day as if night ends at one precise instant. A clock can tell us the minute of sunrise, but if you stand outside before that minute arrives, the world has already begun to change. The darkness is thinner. The horizon has color. Birds respond before the sun appears. Shapes separate themselves from shadow. A road that was invisible becomes faintly visible. Nothing dramatic has happened, and yet everything is already different. This is the power of twilight as an image for the end of an age. The Sanskrit idea of sandhya, a junction or transitional period, appears in many ritual and cosmological settings. Dawn and dusk are spiritually significant precisely because they are neither one condition nor the other. Boundaries become less stable. The world is changing states. If the Yugas are understood as vast changes in the quality of Dharma and consciousness, then their transitions are unlikely to be emotionally simple for the beings living through them. The old age would not vanish from every human mind at once. The new age would not be fully embodied everywhere immediately. Memory, institutions, habits, desires, and structures formed under the old condition would continue even after a deeper movement had begun. This is how change works at every scale we know. A person can understand something before learning how to live it. A family can decide to change while old habits keep returning. A society can reject an injustice legally while carrying its psychological patterns for generations. A technology can transform communication before culture understands what the transformation is doing to attention. Insight can be instantaneous. Embodiment takes time. So if there is a turning between ages, it makes sense to imagine two clocks operating together. The clock of recognition and the clock of integration. The first says, I can see the old pattern now. The second asks, can I build a life that no longer depends on it? These are very different achievements. This may be why the imagined transition from Kali Yuga to a renewed age is more interesting than a simple miracle. A miracle can change circumstances. A transition must change relationship. What would the early signs of that look like? We have to be careful again. No ancient text gives us a verified 21st century checklist saying that when 5 specific modern events occur, the age has officially changed. Anyone presenting such a list with absolute certainty is adding more than the sources can support. But the logic of the tradition allows us to ask what the opposite movement of Kali Yuga would involve. If Kali Yuga weakens truth, renewal would strengthen the desire for truth. If Kali Yuga makes everything transactional, renewal would recover forms of relationship that are not organized around immediate gain. If Kali Yuga turns sacred things into appearance, renewal would produce hunger for authenticity. If Kali Yuga separates power from responsibility, renewal would demand their reunion. If Kali Yuga isolates the individual from nature, renewal would restore reciprocity. If Kali Yuga turns identity into a prison, renewal would loosen the grip of identity without destroying healthy individuality. Notice how quiet these signs are. None requires fire in the sky. A person tells the truth when lying would be profitable. A community restores a damaged river because the river is not merely a resource. A teacher refuses to promise what cannot be known. A student chooses depth over speed. A family rebuilds trust across generations. A powerful person accepts a limit. A young person discovers that silence is not empty. An old person releases the need to control what comes after them. A religious community values transformation more than numbers. A business decides that not everything profitable should be done. These are not glamorous acts, but Dharma has always been more interested in alignment than glamour. This creates a problem for anyone waiting for the end of Kali Yuga as entertainment. What if the first movements of renewal are boring to the mind, trained by Kali Yuga? What if it begins in restraint? What if it begins in restraint? What if it begins in people consuming less rather than acquiring more? What if it begins in fewer words, spoken more carefully? What if it begins in teachers admitting uncertainty? What if it begins in communities rebuilding local trust? What if it begins in a person turning off the noise and discovering that the inner world is more difficult, more frightening and more sacred than the outer stream of stimulation? Would we call that the return of the gods? Probably not. We might not notice it at all, and that may be exactly why the divine can survive a dark age. Kali Yuga is skilled at noticing spectacle. It is less skilled at noticing depth. The things that can outlast the age may therefore be the things the age undervalues. Silence, memory, patience. Local responsibility, long apprenticeship, ritual without audience, service without advertisement, prayer without performance, study without immediate reward, care for places no one famous will visit. These are small forms of resistance to forgetting. If enough such forms connect, a culture changes without a single person being able to name the day it changed. Think of language. No one wakes one morning and announces that a language has become another language. Sounds shift slowly. Grammar changes. Words enter and disappear. Generations understand one another until one day historians look backward and draw a line. The people living through the transition simply speak. The same may be true of ages. Those inside the turning may not experience it as a cosmic announcement. They may experience it as a growing inability to believe what used to seem normal. This is an important feeling. A system begins to weaken when its assumptions stop feeling natural. Imagine someone raised in a culture of endless acquisition. For years, the person believes the next achievement will finally settle the mind. Then one day, after obtaining something once desperately wanted, the old satisfaction fails to arrive. Nothing has gone wrong externally. The person received the promotion, bought the house, reached the number, won the recognition, and yet the expected completion is absent. That absence can become despair, or it can become a doorway. The person may ask, perhaps for the first time, what if I have been asking the wrong thing to save me? That question is a twilight question. The old answer has lost authority. The new answer is not yet clear. This in-between state is uncomfortable because human beings prefer known pain to uncertain possibility. When an identity collapses, there is often a period before a new relationship to life develops. The person says, I know who I am not, but I do not yet know who I am. That is twilight. When a civilization begins to question its deepest measures, it may enter the same condition. We know wealth alone is not fulfillment, but we do not know how to organize society without making growth the central measure. We know constant connection can produce distraction, but we do not know how to live without the systems built around it. We know ecological limits are real, but we struggle to imagine prosperity that respects them. We know ancient traditions contain wisdom, but we also know they contain historical forms that cannot simply be restored. We know individual freedom matters, but we see the loneliness of radical individualism. We know community matters, but we fear the conformity communities can demand. We know science is powerful, but we know scientific measurement does not answer every question of meaning. We know religion can preserve depth, but we know religion can also become rigid, political, or abusive. We stand between answers. That is not necessarily failure. It may be the psychological condition required for a new synthesis. Twilight is dangerous because it is easy to mistake uncertainty for emptiness. When old certainties collapse, people become vulnerable to anyone offering a complete map. This is why transitional ages produce prophets, cults, ideologies, reformers, frauds, and genuine saints side by side. The need for orientation becomes intense. A confused person does not always seek truth. Sometimes he seeks relief from confusion. Those are not the same thing. Truth may increase uncertainty before it resolves it. A false system can feel comforting because it gives every event a meaning, every enemy a label, every follower an identity, and every future a timetable. The spiritual discipline of twilight is therefore patience with not knowing. That may sound weak, but it is one of the hardest disciplines available. To say, I do not know when Kali Yuga ends, and still live by Dharma. I do not know whether Kalki will appear in my lifetime, and still prepare my mind for clarity. I do not know whether the world is ascending or descending on the cosmic scale, and still refuse to add unnecessary darkness. I do not know what happens after death, with the certainty my fear demands, and still live in a way that makes death less shameful. I do not know whether the gods are near in the way the stories describe, and still become quiet enough to discover what the question changes in me. That is mature faith. Faith is not always certainty. Sometimes faith is refusing to abandon the path, simply because the horizon is hidden. This is where the sleep story quality of the Yuga tradition becomes almost literal. Night is an act of surrender. Every evening, you release the day without knowing exactly what consciousness will do in sleep. The mind that spent hours controlling, planning, comparing, and defending eventually loses its grip. Thoughts fragment, images rise, the body becomes heavy. The identity you maintained all day loosens. Then morning returns, and the self assembles itself again. Taoians paid close attention to these thresholds because daily life already contains miniature versions of cosmic patterns: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, birth, life, death, dawn, day, dusk, night, creation, preservation, dissolution, return. The universe repeats transitions at different scales. This is not proof that the Yugas work in any particular astronomical way. It is why their symbolism feels natural to the human mind. We understand cycles because we live inside them. And every cycle teaches the same lessons. A state can feel total while you are inside it and still be temporary. And midnight, darkness is everywhere you look. The absence of dawn from your field of vision does not mean dawn has ceased to exist. It means you are at midnight. This is perhaps the most compassionate way to understand Kali Yuga. Not as a curse, as a position. A position in which certain things are difficult to see. A position in which the horizon is hidden. A position in which navigation requires memory because direct light is weak. This is why tradition matters most when direct perception is difficult. A map is unnecessary if the destination is visible from where you stand. It becomes precious in fog. The scriptures, stories, mantras, rituals, and lineages are maps carried into the fog. But a map creates another danger. People can worship the map and stop traveling. This is a classic Kali Yuga problem. The means replaces the end. A ritual designed to awaken attention becomes a badge of identity. A scripture designed to point beyond the ego becomes a weapon the ego uses against others. A lineage designed to transmit realization becomes a hierarchy designed to protect status. A sacred language becomes a sign of belonging rather than a doorway into meaning. The transition toward renewal would therefore require not the destruction of maps, but their reanimation. What was this practice for? What was this story trying to change? What quality of consciousness did this mantra cultivate? What responsibility did this ritual place on the person performing it? What did this teacher actually ask the student to become? These questions bring breath back into form. The opposite of Kali Yuga is not necessarily more religion, it is more reality inside religion, more truth inside speech, more responsibility inside power, more awareness inside action, more relationship inside knowledge, more sacredness inside ordinary life. This is why the end of an age can begin before anyone agrees that the age is ending. The shift happens first in quality. Quantity may follow later. One person sees, then 10, then a community, then an institution changes. Then a new generation grows up, assuming something that the previous generation had to fight to rediscover. At that point, what was once radical becomes ordinary. That is how culture moves. A golden age, if such an age returns, would not be golden because every person becomes a sage. The old descriptions are idealized, but the essential difference would be environmental support. Truth would be easier to live because the culture would not reward falsehood as strongly. Attention would be easier to protect because the environment would not be designed to fragment it. Dharma would feel less like resistance and more like the natural direction of life. The sacred would not have to compete for every moment. That is what makes Satya Yuga difficult for a Kali Yuga mind to imagine. We think spirituality is a separate activity because separation is normal to us. Work is here, Religion is there, nature is there, family is there, family is there, the self is here. The divine is somewhere beyond. A more integrated age would weaken these walls. Work could become dharma. Care for nature could become worship. Family duty could become spiritual practice. Study could become discipline of the self. Art could become offering. Silence could become companionship. The gods would not need to appear as exceptions because sacredness would again be recognizable in ordinary things. This brings us back to the title of our story. When will the gods return? Perhaps the first return is not their movement toward us. Perhaps it is the return of a world capable of perceiving divine meaning without needing spectacle. In many Hindu traditions, the divine has never been absent in an absolute sense. Vishnu sustains. Shiva is consciousness and transformation. Devi is power, nature, presence. Brahman is the ground of reality. The gods can withdraw from ordinary visibility without the sacred ceasing to permeate existence, so what returns at the end of Kali Yuga may be nearness as experience, recognition, responsiveness, a thinner veil. The sense that reality is not mute. This is difficult to describe in modern language because modern language tends to separate subjective and objective experience sharply. If someone says, "The world felt sacred," we place the statement inside the person's psychology. The world did not change, we say. Their perception changed. The ancient worldview often refuses that clean separation. Perception and world participate in one another. The quality of consciousness affects what reality can disclose. Again, you do not have to accept this metaphysically to understand the insight. A resentful person literally lives in a different experienced world from a grateful person. The same street contains different possibilities depending on attention. The same family meal can be ordinary to one person and precious to another, who nearly lost the family. The same forest can be timber to one person, ecosystem to another, ancestral home to another, sacred presence to another. The world encounter is partly shaped by the consciousness encountering it, so a collective shift in consciousness would produce a collective shift in what the world means, and meaning changes behavior. If a river is only water, you treat it one way. If a river is mother, you treat it another. The ancient world sometimes failed to live up to its own sacred language, of course. Human beings are inconsistent in every age. But the language itself placed limits on pure exploitation by giving the world a face. Renewal may therefore involve more than believing old myths, literally. It may involve recovering forms of perception capable of relationship. Can you look at a tree without immediately placing it inside the category of use? Can you sit with another person without calculating what they think of you? Can you pray without asking for an outcome? Can you study without turning knowledge into identity? Can you care for the body without worshipping appearance? Can you remember death without becoming afraid of life? Each of these is a small restoration of Dharma, and each is possible before the cosmic calendar changes. This is one of the most radical teachings hidden inside the Yuga story. You do not have to wait for the age to become better in order to live differently inside it. The environment influences you. It does not completely determine you. If it did, saints in Kali Yuga would be impossible, yet the tradition is full of them. Poets, bhaktas, yogis, philosophers, householders, wandering renunciants, unknown devotees. Some lived in violent periods, some lived under political upheaval, some lived in poverty. Some faced social exclusion, some challenged religious institutions, some preserved them. Their lives differ enormously, but they demonstrate the same possibility. The age can be dark without every heart being dark. This changes the emotional meaning of the prophecy. You are not trapped waiting for history. History may be trapped waiting for enough human beings to live what they already know. That sentence should be handled carefully. It does not mean a small group can magically change the cosmic yuga through positive thinking. It means culture is made from repeated human action. Whatever the cosmic scale may be, the human scale remains real. You cannot command the age. You can influence the atmosphere immediately around you. You can make one home less dishonest, one friendship less transactional, one workplace less cruel, one mind less fragmented, one tradition less performative, one piece of land better cared for, one child more connected to memory, one conversation more truthful. This is not grand enough for the ego. That is exactly why it matters. Kali Yuga loves grand self-images. Dharma often arrives as the next right thing, the next honest sentence, the next restrained impulse, the next duty completed without applause, the next moment of attention rescued from noise. If the world is ever renewed, It will need people capable of these things. A golden age cannot be built by minds addicted to the habits of a dark one. This is why preparation matters. Not preparation through fear. Not storing supplies for an imaginary date. Not obsessively tracking every disaster as proof that Kalki is near. Preparation of perception. Can you recognize truth when it contradicts you? Can you recognize a teacher who does not flatter you? Can you recognize enough when the market tells you to want more? Can you recognize silence as alive? Can you recognize duty before reward? Can you recognize the sacred without spectacle? If not, even a new age would pass through the old mind unnoticed. This is the deeper meaning of twilight. The sun may be rising, but the eyes still need to open. And that brings us to the question the story has been quietly carrying from the beginning.
If the gods withdrew from easy human perception, what did they leave behind during the long night? What survives when direct contact becomes rare? What can cross an age of forgetting without being destroyed by it? The answer is not one thing. The tradition says the path was hidden in many forms at once, in sound, in story, in the body, in disciplined attention, in sacred geography, in lineage, in the ordinary human capacity to love something more than the ego, and perhaps most mysteriously, in the very longing created by their apparent absence. Chapter 6. What the gods left behind. If you knew a long winter was coming, what would you preserve? You would not preserve flowers. Flowers are beautiful, but fragile. You would preserve seeds. A seed is compressed life. It carries a forest in a form that can survive conditions the forest itself cannot. This is the perfect image for what ancient traditions do during periods of decline. They compress. A vast philosophy becomes a verse. A verse becomes a mantra, a ritual becomes a gesture, a complicated theology becomes a divine name, a lifetime of insight becomes a story a child can remember. The outer world may lose the conditions that once supported the full tradition, but the seed remains portable. This is one reason sound becomes so important in Hindu spiritual life. The Vedas were preserved through extraordinary oral disciplines long before they were primarily encountered as printed books. Reciters developed highly structured methods designed to maintain pronunciation, accent, and sequence with remarkable accuracy across generations. This fact alone is astonishing. Think about what oral preservation requires. No cloud storage, no recording device, no printed backup in every home. A human nervous system becomes the archive. Memory becomes architecture. Teacher corrects student. Student repeats.
Day after day, year after year, generation after generation, the text survives because people become willing to shape their lives around remembering it. That is the opposite of the Kali Yuga relationship to information. Modern information is stored outside the person. You do not need to remember because you can search. The advantage is enormous. Knowledge becomes widely accessible. The cost is subtle. What you can retrieve instantly does not necessarily become part of you. The Vedic reciter did not merely possess the text. The text lived in breath, mouth, ear, timing, and body. It could travel wherever the person traveled. This is preservation through embodiment, and sound has another quality. It disappears as soon as it is made. You cannot hold a spoken syllable in your hand. It exists through attention. When a mantra is repeated, the practitioner returns again and again to something that vanishes and must be renewed. This makes mantra a remarkable practice for an age of fragmentation. The mind wanders. The sound returns. The mind wanders. The sound returns. No grand revelation is required. The practice teaches return itself. This may be why simple devotional practices become especially important in traditions speaking about Kali Yuga. The conditions are difficult, so the means must be available. You may not be able to live in a forest hermitage. You may not master complex ritual. You may not study Sanskrit for decades. You may not have a realized teacher nearby. But you can remember a name. You can repeat it. You can carry it into work, grief, illness, travel, aging, and death. A divine name is a seed. It is small enough to survive the winter. The same is true of story. Why do civilizations tell the same sacred stories again and again? Not because people lack imagination, because repetition creates memory at a level argument cannot reach. A child may not understand a philosophical lecture on Dharma, but the child can remember Rama choosing duty at great personal cost. A child may not understand metaphysics, but can remember Krishna lifting Govardhan, Hanuman crossing the sea, Shiva holding poison, Draupadi calling out when human protection fails. Stories place principles inside images. Images survive. Later, when life produces the corresponding problem, the image opens. The story that seemed simple at 8 years old becomes different at 40, then different again at 70. This is how sacred narrative defeats time. It waits inside the listener until experience gives it another meaning. Kali Yuga can turn stories into entertainment, of course. That is one of its talents. Epic becomes spectacle, deity becomes branding, myth becomes trivia. But the deeper layer remains available. The question is whether anyone returns to the story slowly enough to let it speak beyond the plot. Take the Mahabharata. It is easy to reduce it to heroes and villains, but the text resists simplicity at every turn. Good people make terrible decisions. Oaths produce unintended consequences. Dharma conflicts with dharma. Victory tastes like grief. Knowledge does not protect everyone from weakness. The battlefield is prepared by years of pride, silence, loyalty, humiliation, ambition, and failure. This is not a children's world of easy morality. It is a Kali Yuga preparation text, because it teaches what to do when every available choice contains cost. The gods did not leave behind only commandments. They left stories complex enough for a complex age. Another seed is the body. This may sound surprising because we often imagine spiritual traditions as attempts to escape the body. Hindu traditions include world-renouncing currents, certainly, but they also contain sophisticated systems that treat the body as a field through which consciousness can be investigated. Yoga, in its many forms, is the obvious example. Breath, posture, attention, sense restraint, concentration, meditation. These practices do not require the external world to become sacred first. They begin with the instrument you already have. This matters enormously in an age of decline. Institutions can fall, temples can be damaged, books can be lost, teachers can disappear, political orders can change. But as long as a human being can breathe and attend, an inner doorway remains. This should not be romanticized. Bodies become sick. Trauma affects attention. Poverty limits time. Not everyone has equal access to practice. Spiritual language should never be used to pretend material suffering does not matter, but the fundamental accessibility of breath is still profound. The breath is always crossing a threshold. Outside becomes inside. Inside becomes outside. You receive, you release, again and again, without needing belief. If you want to understand the Yugas through the body, listen to one full breath. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause, expansion, fullness, release, emptiness, return. The cycle is written into you. This is why cosmic imagery can become practical. You do not control the entire cycle, you participate in it. Another thing preserved is sacred geography. India is filled with places whose meaning cannot be reduced to architecture. Rivers, mountains, confluences, caves, forests, pilgrimage roads, temple towns. A sacred geography gives memory a location. You do not only remember a story in your head, you walk where the story is remembered. You bathe in the river generations approached before you. You climb the hill. You circle the shrine. You cross distance with the body, and distance itself becomes part of the practice. Pilgrimage is powerful because it interrupts ordinary efficiency. The destination may be reached by faster means, but pilgrimage traditionally gives value to the journey. Feet hurt, weather changes, plans fail, strangers help. The body becomes tired enough that the usual identity weakens. The sacred place then arrives not as content but as encounter. Kali Yuga can turn pilgrimage into tourism, certainly. Photographs can replace attention, crowds can replace silence. Commerce can surround the shrine, but again the seed remains. A person can stand in the same crowd and experience something entirely different depending on why they came. This is a recurring truth of the Dark Age. Purity of environment becomes harder. Purity of intention becomes more important. Another preserved seed is lineage. The Sanskrit idea of parampara, transmission through succession, expresses a simple principle. Not everything important can be learned from a page. Technique may be written. Information may be recorded. But judgment, timing, correction, and embodied understanding often require relationship. This is true even outside spirituality. You can read about music and still need a musician to hear what you are doing wrong. You can study surgery from books and still need supervised practice. You can watch a craft online and still learn differently beside someone whose hands have done it for 30 years. Spiritual disciplines are no different. A mature teacher can sometimes see where a student is deceiving himself before the student can. That is why genuine lineage can protect against self-invention, but lineage has its own Kali Yuga danger. Authority can become unquestionable, transmission can become inherited status, abuse can hide behind sacred language. Students can surrender judgment because obedience feels spiritual, so even lineage requires viveka. A dark age does not allow us the luxury of innocence. We need reverence without blindness, skepticism without cynicism, openness without gullibility, trust that can still ask questions. This balance is difficult, but perhaps difficulty is exactly the training of the age. The next thing preserved is more subtle than scripture, body, or lineage. It is conscience. Across Hindu philosophical systems, the details of mind and self differ. But there remains a persistent understanding that the human being can know more deeply than immediate desire. You have experienced this. You want to say something cruel, and another part of you knows not to say it. You want to take an unfair advantage, and something contracts. You rationalize a decision, but the rationalization does not become quiet inside you. You receive praise you did not earn, and somewhere the pleasure is mixed with discomfort. This inner friction is not perfect. Conscience can be conditioned badly. People can feel guilty for healthy choices and shameless about harmful ones. That is why conscience must be educated. But the capacity for inner witness remains. Something in us can step back from impulse and observe it. That capacity may be one of the most important divine seeds in Kali Yuga. The age can shape your desires. It does not have total ownership of the one who sees desire arise. The Upanishadic traditions take this much further. They ask you to investigate the witness itself. You know the body because sensations appear to awareness. You know thoughts because thoughts appear to awareness. You know emotions because emotions appear to awareness. You even know the sense of identity because the feeling I am this kind of person appears and changes. What then is the awareness to which all of these appear? The Upanishads turn this question into one of the deepest inquiries in human history. Atman is not simply personality. It is not your biography. It is not the list of things you like. It is not your public identity. It points toward the deepest self, ultimately understood in non-dual traditions as not separate from Brahman, the ground of reality. If that teaching is true, then the gods never fully left. The sacred withdrew from obvious visibility but remained at the center of the one who was looking for it. The seeker walked through the world asking where the divine had gone while carrying the doorway inside the act of seeking. This is one of the great reversals of Indian spirituality. You search outward until the search exhausts itself. Then attention turns toward the one who is searching, who wants the gods to return, who feels abandoned, who experiences distance, who is aware of the thought, the divine is far away. Follow the question inward and the geography changes. Kali Yuga may be vast in historical time. The distance to the witness is immediate. This is why inner practice can be described as timeless even inside a doctrine of cosmic ages. The Yuga affects conditions. It does not necessarily affect the absolute nature of consciousness itself. Clouds change the sky we see. They do not injure the space in which they appear. This image appears in many spiritual traditions because it captures the distinction between condition and ground. Kali Yuga is weather. Brahman is sky. The weather matters. It can be violent. It can hide everything. It can determine whether travel is possible. But weather does not become the sky itself. Another seed preserved through the age is devotion. Bhakti is sometimes misunderstood as emotional belief for people who cannot handle philosophy. That is a shallow reading. Devotion is a radical reorganization of desire. The ordinary mind says, I want this object, this person, this success, this recognition, this security. Bhakti takes the energy of wanting and turns it toward the divine. The wanting does not disappear. It is transformed. This makes Bhakti especially powerful in Kali Yuga because desire is already strong. The path does not always try to eliminate the river. It changes where the river flows. The songs of the Bhakti saints are filled with longing, complaint, love, surrender, jealousy, absence, intimacy, and tears. The divine is not approached only through cold abstraction. Every human emotion becomes material for relationship. This is important for an age of emotional fragmentation. People often believe spirituality requires becoming less human. Bhakti says bring the human heart completely. Bring grief, bring anger, bring confusion, bring longing, bring love. But bring it honestly. Do not perform devotion for an audience. Do not turn longing into identity. offer it. The divine name then becomes more than sound, it becomes the address of longing. This may be why so many traditions emphasize name remembrance in Kali Yuga. When the mind cannot hold complicated metaphysics, the heart can still call. A name is enough to begin. Another preserved seed is Siva, service. Service is spiritually dangerous to the ego because it can be done without a special experience. You do not need a vision. You do not need mystical energy. You do not need to feel awakened. Someone is hungry, feed them. Someone is ill, sit with them. A place is dirty, clean it. A child needs teaching, teach. An elder needs patience, listen. The river is damaged, help restore it. Service brings spirituality down from imagination into consequence. This is essential in Kali Yuga because imagination becomes cheap. Anyone can imagine being compassionate. Service creates a body for compassion. Anyone can say all beings are one. Service asks whether that unity survives inconvenience. Anyone can post a sacred quotation. Service asks what happens when no one is watching. The gods, if they are hidden, may be hidden in exactly these places. The face of the person you would rather avoid, the duty you would rather postpone, the work that produces no status, the moment when irritation becomes an opportunity to practice restraint. A dark age encourages us to seek dramatic portals. Dharma keeps placing the portal in ordinary action. The final seed may be the most mysterious, absence itself. What if the feeling that the gods are gone is part of what keeps the search alive? When something is constantly available, we stop noticing it. The sound of a fan disappears from awareness until the fan stops. The presence of a loved one can become ordinary until separation reveals its value. Health is invisible until illness. Water is ordinary until thirst. Could divine absence function the same way, not as punishment, as revelation through contrast? In Satya Yuga, if the sacred is obvious, perhaps devotion has the ease of breathing. In Kali Yuga, if the sacred is hidden, a person who continues to seek develops another quality. Faith without constant confirmation, love across distance, attention without spectacle, commitment without reward, the ability to call into silence and remain present even when no answer arrives immediately. That is not a lesser devotion. It may be a fierce one. This is why some Hindu traditions describe spiritual practice in Kali Yuga as capable of unusual power relative to the difficulty of the age. The details differ by source, but the principle is understandable. Effort under resistance has a particular weight. A candle at noon is barely noticed. A candle in a dark room changes the entire room. The flame is the same size. The context changes its significance. This may be the hidden grace of Kali Yuga. You do not need to become a cosmic hero. You need to keep one flame alive: truth, attention, devotion, service, memory, discernment. Enough of these flames, carried from person to person, and the dark age never becomes absolute. The gods left behind seeds, because seeds know how to wait. They do not panic in winter. They do not conclude that the sun has died, because the soil is cold. They hold form in darkness. Then, when conditions change, what looked lifeless becomes movement. Perhaps this is what a return would actually reveal. Not that the divine suddenly remembers humanity, that humanity discovers how much was preserved while it thought it was abandoned. And now we are ready for the final part of the story. Not the question of what Kali Yuga is, not the argument about how long it lasts, not the list of signs, not even the image of Kalki. The final question is the one the title promised. When do they return? To answer it honestly, we have to separate three different kinds of return that people often confuse. The return in the traditional cosmic chronology, the return represented by Kalki and the restoration of Dharma, and the return that can occur in human perception before either of those questions is settled. Those three answers are not identical, but together they reveal why the old story has survived so long. Chapter 7. When they return. There are three answers to the question, and the first is the least satisfying emotionally because it refuses to make our lifetime the center of cosmic history. According to the mainstream Puranic chronology, Kali Yuga lasts 432,000 years. Its beginning is traditionally placed in 3102 BCE. On that scale, the age has only just begun. If you accept that chronology literally, then the complete cosmic transition is unimaginably far away. Kalki does not arrive next Tuesday. He does not arrive because a war begins, because an eclipse appears, because a technology frightens us, or because one generation believes the world has become uniquely corrupt. The cycle is vastly larger than our anxiety. This answer can feel disappointing because apocalyptic stories are exciting when they are about us. We want to be the generation standing at the final gate. We want our problems to be the final problems. We want our confusion to be proof that the old world is collapsing. We want history to look at us. But perhaps one of the disciplines Kali Yuga demands is the humility to accept that the universe may not be organized around our need to feel historically special. You can live a meaningful life without living at the end of the age. You can practice Dharma without being the last generation before Kalki. You can protect sacred memory even if the full turning lies beyond every horizon humanity currently knows. In fact, if the long chronology is correct, preserving Dharma becomes even more extraordinary. Imagine carrying a flame that you know you will never see become sunrise. You protect it anyway, not for reward, not because you expect to witness completion, because the flame is worth protecting. This is what civilizations do at their best. They build things they will not finish. They plant trees whose shade belongs to strangers. They preserve languages for children not yet born. They repair temples knowing weather will damage them again. They teach students who will surpass them. They pass forward what they received. A long Kali Yuga turns spiritual practice into stewardship. You are not the owner of Dharma. You are one temporary carrier. This is a deeply beautiful answer, even if it is not dramatic. The second answer comes from alternative Yuga models, such as Sri Yukteswar's shorter cycle. In that reading, humanity has already passed the lowest point of the cycle and entered an ascending Dvapara Yuga centuries ago. If that model is accepted, then the question, when will the gods return, changes completely. The return is not waiting hundreds of thousands of years ahead. The upward movement has already begun, but even here, caution is necessary. An ascending age is not the same as a perfect age. If humanity entered a more energetic or mentally expansive stage around the modern period, that would not mean war disappears, greed disappears, or every person becomes spiritually mature. It would mean the available conditions are changing. That interpretation is often connected by followers to modern developments in energy, communication, science, and global awareness. Whether those correlations prove the cosmology is another question. Human beings are very good at fitting patterns after the fact. Still, the model offers a powerful symbolic insight. An age can be moving upward, while much of the world still feels confused. Growth does not always feel better at first. When sensation returns to a numb limb, it can hurt. When a person begins facing buried grief, psychological health may initially feel worse. When a society becomes more aware of injustice, conflict can become more visible before it decreases. When information becomes freer, truth and falsehood can both spread faster. Increased capacity magnifies what is already present until wisdom catches up. So even an ascending yuga could look chaotic. This is important because people often imagine spiritual progress as smooth improvement. But awakening is not always soothing. Clarity destroys some comforts. The person who begins seeing manipulation feels more disturbed before becoming freer. The person who recognizes an addiction feels worse before recovery because denial had been protecting the old identity. The person who sees the suffering hidden behind convenient consumption may initially lose ease. The world can become morally more difficult to inhabit precisely because more becomes visible. If human consciousness were entering a more expansive phase, one sign might therefore be intensified contradiction rather than immediate harmony. Old systems become more powerful and less believable at the same time. Old identities become louder because they feel threatened. New possibilities appear before new wisdom develops. The age feels unstable because stability belonged to structures that no longer fit the emerging conditions. Again, none of this proves a Yuga date. It simply shows why transition cannot be judged by comfort alone. The third answer is the one most directly available to us. The gods return whenever sacred perception returns. This does not replace the traditional prophecy. It does not mean Kalki is only a metaphor or that cosmic chronology is irrelevant. Different Hindu traditions will answer those questions differently. But at the level of lived spiritual practice, divine nearness has always been available before the end of Kali Yuga. Otherwise, every saint, mystic, and devotee born in the Dark Age would be impossible. The age makes recognition harder. It does not make recognition impossible. And this means the return can happen in miniature. A person who has treated a river as scenery suddenly experiences it as sacred. A person who repeated a mantra mechanically for years suddenly hears it. A person who used ritual as habit suddenly understands the offering. A person who feared silence begins to experience silence as presence. A person who thought devotion was weakness discovers that surrender requires more courage than control. A person who spent years studying philosophy finally sees the difference between thinking about consciousness and resting as awareness. Nothing arrives from the sky, yet a world returns. This is not merely subjective comfort. Perception changes conduct. The person who sees the river differently acts differently toward the river. The person who sees another being differently speaks differently. The person who sees wealth differently spends differently. The person who sees attention as sacred protects it differently. Inner return becomes outer consequence. This is why the spiritual and social dimensions of Dharma cannot finally be separated. A private realization that changes nothing may be only another experience. A genuine shift reorganizes relationship. The gods return through what becomes possible when the human being stops treating everything as object. This is easier to say than to live. The objectifying mind is efficient. It names, categorizes, and uses. You need it to function. A chair is a chair. A road is a road. A tool is a tool. The problem begins when that mode becomes total. Then a forest is only timber. An animal is only product. A worker is only labor. A student is only a score. A patient is only a case. A follower is only a number. A body is only appearance. A tradition is only content. A god is only an image. Dharma restores depth to relationship. That is a kind of return. The gods return when the world is no longer flat, when things carry more meaning than their immediate use, when duty becomes more than inconvenience, when a promise has weight even when breaking it would be easy, when hospitality becomes more than social performance, when food is received with gratitude rather than consumed unconsciously, when death is remembered as part of life rather than treated as a failure of the system, when the old are not merely obsolete bodies and the young are not merely future producers, when time has sacred intervals again, when dawn means more than the hour work begins, when night means more than the remaining screen time before sleep. This may sound romantic, but it does not require rejecting modern life. You do not have to abandon electricity to recover sacred time. You do not have to reject medicine to respect death. You do not have to leave cities to care for nature. You do not have to imitate ancient clothing to live Dharma. The challenge is more difficult because it asks you to bring depth into the world you actually inhabit. Anyone can imagine becoming spiritual in a Himalayan cave. The question is whether you can protect attention in a room with a phone. Anyone can imagine being peaceful in a forest. The question is whether you can remain truthful in a meeting where dishonesty is rewarded. Anyone can admire ancient simplicity. The question is whether you can define enough while living inside an economy built on more. Anyone can praise devotion in a temple. The question is whether devotion changes the way you treat the person who irritates you at home. Kali Yuga is not defeated by aesthetic preference. It is challenged by embodied Dharma. This is why the final avatar cannot be understood only as an external savior. Even if Kalki appears literally as the tradition describes, the world after Kalki still requires human beings capable of living the restored order. A new age needs new habits. The same is true in every personal transformation. You can leave a destructive relationship, but if the pattern that chose it remains unchanged, the pattern may choose again. You can change jobs, but if the need for approval remains, the new job can become the old prison. You can join a different spiritual group, but if you still crave certainty and specialness, a new teacher can occupy the same psychological role. External change without inner change rearranges the furniture. The room remains the same. Kalki, understood deeply, changes the room. The sword cuts the pattern. The white horse carries a different direction. The restoration of Dharma becomes possible because the age's central confusion is no longer protected. What would that look like collectively? We cannot know. Any detailed description risks turning hope into fantasy, but we can imagine principles. A society closer to Dharma would probably define success more broadly than accumulation. It would recognize that power requires restraint. It would treat education as formation of judgment, not only preparation for employment. It would preserve spaces where human attention is not constantly bought and sold. It would understand ecological systems as conditions of life, not obstacles to growth. It would maintain intergenerational memory without demanding blind obedience to the past. It would allow spiritual life to remain sacred without using sacred authority to escape accountability. None of these principles belongs exclusively to Hinduism. That is not the point. Dharma is described within Hindu traditions in distinctive ways, but the human problems it addresses are widely recognizable. The old story survives because it places those problems inside an image large enough to humble us. A cosmic wheel, a dark age, a final rider, a return of truth. The image says your confusion is real, but it is not reality itself. That distinction may be the most important thing a dark age can remember. Confusion feels total when you are confused. Anxiety feels prophetic when you are anxious. Loneliness feels like a statement about the universe when you are lonely. Failure feels like identity when you are failing. But states are not the whole. The Yuga story repeats this at cosmic scale. No state is the whole. Satya Yuga is not the whole. Kali Yuga is not the whole. The wheel is larger than the position. Brahman is larger than the wheel. This widening of scale can be deeply calming. The world may be in disorder. Your life may contain unresolved problems. You may not know what history is becoming. But you do not have to solve the entire age before resting tonight. The old traditions were carried through thousands of ordinary nights by people who did not know what their descendants would face. They completed one recitation, one prayer, one act of service, one meal offered, one child taught, one duty done. Then they slept. The age continued without requiring them to carry it alone. This is a lesson modern minds need because global information creates global emotional burden. You can know about suffering everywhere at once, war in one country, flood in another, fire somewhere else, political conflict, economic fear, environmental loss, violence, injustice. Every hour, the mind receives evidence that the world is too large to repair. The result can be moral exhaustion. A person begins caring about everything and therefore becomes capable of acting on almost nothing. Dharma brings scale back to responsibility. What is yours to do? Not what can you feel guilty about. What is actually yours? Your speech, your work, your relationships, your use of power, your consumption, your attention, your treatment of the vulnerable beings whose lives intersect yours. Your practice, your willingness to learn, your willingness to correct yourself. This is not an excuse to ignore large problems. It is how large problems become actionable. A person who knows their sphere of responsibility can join with others. A person drowning in abstract guilt often does nothing. The Bhagavad Gita's emphasis on Svadharma, one's own duty, is complicated and historically situated, but the psychological principle remains powerful. There is work that belongs to you more directly than other work. Do that work with clarity. Do not use the scale of the world to escape the scale of your own conduct. This is how a person lives in Kali Yuga without becoming Kali Yuga. You may live in an age of noise. You do not have to become noise. You may live in an age of display. You do not have to turn your inner life into display. You may live in an age of appetite. You can learn enough. You may live in an age of division. You can refuse unnecessary hatred. You may live in an age of false certainty. You can say, I do not know. You may live in an age of spiritual markets. You can become a serious student. You may live in an age of speed. You can do one thing slowly. These acts do not end the Yuga. They end its unquestioned rule inside you. That is the beginning of inner return. Now consider the possibility that the gods return in the form of recognition before they return in the form of cosmic event. What would recognition require? First, attention. You cannot recognize what you never notice. Second, humility. If you have already decided what the divine must look like, anything outside your expectation will be rejected. Third, discrimination. Not everything mysterious is sacred. Not every intense emotion is revelation. Not every coincidence is a sign. Not every charismatic person is a teacher. Not every ancient claim is true simply because it is ancient. Not every modern claim is false simply because it is modern. Fourth, courage. Recognition may require changing your life. It is easy to want revelation as experience. It is harder to want revelation as responsibility. If you suddenly understood exactly what you should do, would you be relieved or frightened? Clarity removes excuses. This is why people sometimes remain confused on purpose without admitting it. As long as the answer is unclear, every path remains possible. Once the answer becomes clear, some doors close. Kalki's sword is frightening because it closes false doors. The return of the gods, then, may not feel like receiving more possibilities. It may feel like losing the ability to continue pretending that every possibility is equal. This brings us to another old idea, darshan. In Hindu religious life, darshan is more than looking at an image of a deity. It is seeing and being seen. The encounter is reciprocal. You go to the temple to see the divine form, but the divine also sees you. This changes the meaning of return. If the gods return, humanity does not simply become spectator. We are exposed to sight. To be seen completely is not only comforting, it means the masks fail, the public identity, the private excuses, the spiritual performance, the story you tell yourself about your motives. All of it becomes transparent. Perhaps this is why divine presence and judgment are so often linked in religious imagination. Judgment does not always require punishment. Perfect seeing is already judgment because nothing false can hide inside it. Imagine being seen without condemnation and without the possibility of deception. That may be more transformative than fear. A person can defend against accusation. It is harder to defend against truth spoken with no hatred. Kalki's clarity can be imagined this way. Not rage searching for enemies, sight that leaves no place for adharma to pretend it is dharma. That would change politics, religion, commerce, and personal identity at the same time because so many systems depend on misnaming. Greed calls itself ambition. Cowardice calls itself caution. Control calls itself love. Vanity calls itself self-expression. Hatred calls itself righteousness. Indifference calls itself neutrality. Fear calls itself tradition. Appetite calls itself freedom. Exhaustion calls itself success. The sword restores names. This is why truth is dangerous to every age built on confusion. And why the return of the gods, if understood as return of sacred truth, would not belong exclusively to religious people. Religious institutions can fear truth as much as secular ones. A temple can defend reputation. A guru can defend power. A devotee can defend identity. No group receives automatic immunity because it uses sacred language. In fact, the more sacred the language, the greater the danger when language becomes cover for adharma. This is another reason the avatar comes at the end rather than simply endorsing what already calls itself religion. Restoration is not confirmation, it is correction. The distinction is severe. If the gods return only to tell us we were right all along, then what returns is probably our imagination. The divine in these stories repeatedly disrupts expectation. Krishna does not behave like a simple moral symbol. Shiva does not fit polite categories. Devi can nourish and terrify. Vishnu appears in forms appropriate to crises humans did not know how to solve. The sacred exceeds our preference, so if you want to prepare for return, practice being corrected. This is one of the most practical spiritual disciplines available. Can you hear a fact you dislike? Can you change your mind without feeling destroyed? Can you apologize without adding a defense? Can you discover that a teacher you admired was wrong about something without collapsing into cynicism? Can you discover that a tradition you criticized contains wisdom without surrendering judgment? Can you hold complexity? A mind that cannot be corrected cannot receive revelation. It can only receive confirmation. Kali Yuga is full of confirmation systems. Algorithms show you more of what holds your attention. Groups repeat what proves the group is right. Identity selects evidence. The mind becomes a temple built for itself. The return of the gods would begin by breaking the mirror. Not because the self is worthless, because the self is not the whole. This is one reason the Upanishadic teaching becomes so important at the end of our story. If Atman is not the ego, then losing an egoic identity is not losing the deepest self. It is losing a mistaken boundary. The person who believes the wave is separate from the ocean fears every change in the wave. The teaching says, know yourself as water. Forms rise and fall. The substance remains. Again, this is a philosophical claim, not something everyone must accept. But within the tradition, it explains why divine return is ultimately a return to what is already deepest. Brahman does not travel from a distant location. Awareness recognizes its ground. The gods become visible because the field of perception changes. Kalki restores Dharma because the collective field changes. Satya Yuga returns because truth becomes the atmosphere again. The levels reflect one another. This gives us a final way to think about time. There is chronological time, measured by calendars and yuga calculations. There is cultural time, measured by the changing values of civilizations. And there is spiritual time, measured by readiness. A person can live in Kali Yuga chronologically and experience a moment of Satya, a moment in which truth is unobstructed. A person can live in a prosperous civilization culturally and inhabit deep inner Kali, confusion, greed, and fear. A single day can contain multiple ages psychologically. Morning clarity, afternoon ambition, evening resentment, night surrender. The cosmic system becomes a mirror for the inner system. This does not reduce cosmology to psychology. It makes the story usable. Otherwise, we are left with numbers too large to change the way we live. The deepest traditions rarely give knowledge only to satisfy curiosity. Knowledge carries practice. If you learn that life is impermanent, remember death. If you learn that attention is unstable, train it. If you learn that desire multiplies, examine it. If you learn that Dharma weakens in Kali Yuga, become deliberate about Dharma. If you learn that Kalki represents the end of confusion, sharpen discriminations, if you learn that the divine is hidden in the heart, become quiet enough to test what that could mean, then the prophecy stops being entertainment, it becomes instruction. This is the difference between watching the horizon and preparing the eyes. You can spend your life asking whether the rider is coming, or you can become the kind of person who would recognize what the rider represents. Only one of those choices is available tonight, and perhaps that is enough. The Dark Age trains us to think that only large events matter. Millions of views, mass movements, global change, historic moments, but every large change is made of small acts that became aligned. A scripture survives because one mouth repeated one line correctly. A tradition survives because one teacher taught one student. A family changes because one person stops repeating one inherited cruelty. A community changes because one group tells the truth about one hidden problem. A landscape changes because someone protects one source of water. A mind changes because one thought is finally seen clearly. The divine return may be cosmic. Preparation is always local. This is where the story becomes gentle again. You do not need to solve Kali Yuga before you sleep. You do not need to calculate the age of the universe. You do not need to decide tonight whether Sri Yukteswar or the traditional Puranic chronology is correct. You do not need to know the physical location of Shambhala. You do not need to interpret every disaster as a sign. You do not need to identify Kalki in a living person. In fact, you should be extremely cautious of anyone who asks you to do that. You need only notice what the story has been pointing toward. The age of forgetting is challenged by remembrance. The age of noise is challenged by attention. The age of appearance is challenged by sincerity. The age of appetite is challenged by enough. The age of fragmentation is challenged by relationship. The age of false certainty is challenged by honest inquiry. The age of adharma is challenged by the next act of dharma. These are small swords. They cut quietly, and every cut makes the fog slightly less convincing. There is one more question, however, and it is the most mysterious one. Why would the gods leave at all? If divine presence is good, why should a cosmic cycle ever descend into an age of forgetting? Why not remain forever in Satya Yuga? Why permit Kali Yuga? The tradition gives many answers depending on school and text, but cyclical cosmology suggests something larger than moral preference. Manifestation moves. Creation, preservation, and dissolution are all part of reality. Day needs night, not because night is morally superior, but because cycles include withdrawal, breath includes exhalation, life includes death, seeds include dormancy, consciousness includes waking and sleep. A universe without change would not be the manifest universe we know. Kali Yuga, in this perspective, is not a cosmic mistake. It is one phase of a total movement whose meaning cannot be judged from inside the phase alone. This is difficult because suffering inside the phase is real. Telling a suffering person that everything is part of a cosmic cycle can become cruel if used to dismiss pain. Dharma does not require indifference. If anything, awareness of decline should increase compassion because beings are struggling under difficult conditions. The winter metaphor should never become an excuse not to feed someone who is cold. You can accept that winter is a season and still build shelter. You can accept that Kali Yuga is an age and still oppose cruelty. Cosmology does not replace responsibility. This distinction protects spiritual teachings from becoming fatalism. Kali Yuga is not an excuse, it is context. The person who says, "Everyone is corrupt because it is Kali Yuga, so my corruption does not matter," has misunderstood the teaching completely. Difficulty increases responsibility. It does not erase it. A storm is not permission to abandon the wheel. It is the reason to hold it more carefully. And if the darkness is part of a cycle, perhaps the most meaningful thing a human being can do is become a point through which the cycle does not completely determine conduct. The age says lie. You tell the truth. The age says display. You practice privately. The age says consume. You stop at enough. The age says hate. You refuse hatred without becoming naive about harm. The age says react. You wait long enough to see. The age says forget. You remember. This is freedom inside condition, not freedom from condition, and that may be the human role in the Yuga story. The gods move through cosmic time. Human beings choose how to meet the movement. When the divine seems near, we can become careless because nearness is easy. When the divine seems far, we can become deliberate because every act of remembrance must cross distance. The Dark Age therefore produces a unique kind of devotee, one who loves without constant proof, one who practices without cultural support, one who remains honest without expecting honesty to be rewarded immediately. one who protects the sacred without knowing whether the world will value what is protected, one who carries a seed through winter. Perhaps this is why you are drawn to the question of return, not because you need a date, because some part of you recognizes the winter. You recognize the fatigue of too much noise, the emptiness after achievement, the strange loneliness of constant connection, the difficulty of knowing what to trust, the feeling that something essential has been flattened into entertainment, the suspicion that human beings are more than the roles they perform and the things they consume. The desire for a world in which truth feels less expensive. That desire is not proof of prophecy, but it is information about the soul. It tells you what you are hungry for. Do not waste that hunger by feeding it endless predictions. Let it become practice. If you long for truth, become more truthful. If you long for sacredness, treat something sacredly. If you long for divine nearness, create silence in which nearness could be noticed. If you long for Satya Yuga, make one corner of your life less dependent on Kali Yuga values. This is not grand, it is real. And reality is where Dharma begins. Chapter 8. The World After the Dark Age. It is easy to imagine the end of Kali Yuga. It is harder to imagine the morning after. Destruction is simply in the mind. A structure falls. A corrupt order ends. A sword flashes. The rider passes. The old age is finished. But renewal asks more difficult questions. What do people value when the old measures lose their authority? How do they raise children? How do they use power? How do they understand nature? What becomes of knowledge? What does religion look like when it no longer needs to compete with constant distraction? What would it mean for Dharma to stand strongly again? Traditional descriptions of Satya Yuga are idealized. Truth dominates. Human life is longer and more harmonious. Spiritual awareness is natural. Dharma is strong. The distance between human beings and the sacred is small. If we read these descriptions only as fantasy, they become a pleasant picture of a world we do not inhabit. If we read them as contrast, they become more useful. Satya Yuga tells us what Kali Yuga lacks, not gadgets, not comfort, not complexity, alignment. In the age of truth, what is inward and what is outward are closer together. A person does not need to manufacture an image because image and character are less divided. A ruler cannot easily separate authority from duty because the legitimacy of power rests inside Dharma. Knowledge is not merely accumulated because knowing implies becoming. Nature is not merely material because the sacred is recognized through it. Ritual is not performance because the reality ritual points toward is not distant. This is why Satya Yuga can sound impossible to us. We imagine morality as constant self-control against desire. What would happen if desire itself were better ordered? We imagine truthfulness as courageous because lying can be advantageous. What would happen if social conditions did not reward falsehood as strongly? We imagine spiritual practice as carving time out of a busy life. What would happen if the structure of life supported recollection naturally? A golden age is not simply a dark age with nicer people. It is a different relationship between people, culture, and consciousness. This helps explain why the transition cannot be reduced to replacing bad rulers with good rulers. Politics matters, but politics cannot create a Satya Yuga mind by law. Education matters, but information alone cannot create wisdom. Economic systems matter, but no system can define enough for a person who refuses all limits. Technology matters, but technology magnifies the consciousness using it. Religion matters, but religion without inner transformation becomes another institution of the age. The turning must therefore happen across levels, inner and outer, individual and collective, material and sacred. This is why avatar stories are so large. They do not describe minor reform, they describe reordering. When Vishnu appears in different forms across the traditional avatar sequence, the form fits the crisis. The mythology moves from aquatic and animal forms through heroic and royal forms toward figures who address increasingly complex conditions of consciousness and social order. Different interpreters understand the sequence differently, but the general pattern suggests adaptation. The divine does not repeat the same answer regardless of the question. Kalki belongs to a crisis of final confusion. His symbolism is therefore sharp, movement, clarity, completion. The white horse does not wander. The sword does not negotiate with fog. The age reaches a point where ambiguity can no longer support what has become unsustainable. Then comes restoration. But restoration is not rewind. This point deserves to be repeated because spiritual nostalgia can become dangerous. A future age is not obligated to reconstruct an ancient civilization exactly. Dharma existed before any modern institution and can express itself through forms we have not yet imagined. The question is not whether people in a renewed world would use old or new technology. The question is what consciousness directs the technology. A tool in the hand of greed becomes one thing. The same tool in the hand of responsibility becomes another. Fire cooks and burns. Language heals and wounds. Money supports life and corrupts desire. Technology is not outside Dharma. Nothing used by human beings is outside the question of relationship. So imagine, only as a thought experiment, a civilization with great technical power and stronger dharmic orientation. What changes? The first change might be the meaning of progress. Progress would no longer mean only more production, more speed, more consumption, or more control. It would include whether human beings are becoming more capable of truth, restraint, relationship, and wisdom. A society might ask not only, can we build this, but what kind of people will living with this create? That second question is almost absent whenever capability outruns reflection. The next change might be education. An education system ordered by Dharma would not abandon science, mathematics, history, or practical skill. It would add the formation of attention and character as central aims. Children would learn not only how to compete, but how to concentrate, not only how to speak, but how to listen, not only how to calculate advantage, but how to recognize responsibility, not only how to acquire information, but how to judge its quality, not only how to earn, but how to define enough. Imagine how different adulthood becomes when those capacities are trained early. The next change might be the relationship with aging. A Kali Yuga culture that worships novelty treats old age as decline with little social meaning beyond survival. A dharmic culture can recognize the losses of age without discarding the value of accumulated experience. Elders would not be automatically wise. Age alone does not produce wisdom. But a society would create roles through which experience can be transmitted. The old would have duties to the young. The young would have duties to the old. Dependence would not be treated as humiliation because every human being begins and often ends life dependent on others. This changes the emotional structure of community. Another change would concern death. Modern societies often hide death until it forces itself into view. A dharmic society would not romanticize death, but it would integrate mortality into education and ritual. People would understand that impermanence is not a defect in life, it is one of its conditions. This changes ambition. If you remember death honestly, some goals become smaller and some duties become larger. The argument you wanted to win matters less. The person you have not forgiven becomes more urgent. The hours traded entirely for status look different. The neglected body asks for care. The neglected soul asks a harder question. A society that remembers death may consume differently because endless accumulation looks strange beside a finite life. Another change would be the meaning of wealth. Artha would remain a legitimate human aim, but it would sit inside Dharma rather than replacing it. Wealth would be evaluated partly by what it allows a person to support: family, community, knowledge, art, care, sacred institutions, ecological restoration, time for practice. The wealthy person would not be automatically condemned or automatically admired. The question would be stewardship. What flows through your hands, and what does it become? This is an old question with new relevance. Another change would be the status of attention. Attention is one of the most valuable resources in modern life, yet individuals often treat it as free. Companies compete for it, politics competes for it, entertainment competes for it, fear competes for it, desire competes for it. A culture moving toward Dharma would understand attention as a condition of freedom. If you cannot direct attention, your choices are easier to direct from outside. Training attention would therefore be civic as well as spiritual. A person capable of concentration is harder to manipulate. A person capable of silence is harder to addict to noise. A person capable of watching desire arise is harder to control through desire. This is why meditation can be politically quiet and psychologically radical at the same time. It returns ownership of attention to the person who is attending. Another change would concern disagreement. A Satya-oriented culture would not need everyone to share the same opinion. Truthfulness does not eliminate difference, but identity would be less dependent on winning every disagreement. People could say, "I was wrong," That sentence may be one of the simplest signs of spiritual health. A civilization in which no one can say it becomes brittle. Correction becomes humiliation. Humiliation produces defense. Defense produces deeper error. Viveka requires the ability to revise perception. Kalki's sword is useless in a hand that refuses to cut its own mistake. Another change would concern sacred plurality. Hindu traditions themselves contain extraordinary diversity. Devotion to Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, forms of non-dual philosophy, dual philosophy, qualified non-dualism, ritual traditions, yogic systems, local deities, temple practices, household worship, renunciation, philosophical debate. The tradition survived partly because it learned to hold difference without requiring one single form to erase all others. That history was not always peaceful, but plurality remains deeply embedded. A dharmic renewal would therefore not need one uniform spiritual culture. It would require the ability to recognize genuine paths without collapsing discernment. Plurality is not the claim that every teaching is equally true. It is the willingness to accept that truth may be approached through more than one legitimate discipline. This matters in a global age where traditions meet constantly. Kali Yuga can turn difference into market competition or identity war. A more mature age might turn difference into encounter. What do you see that I do not? What have you preserved? What is the discipline behind your language? Where does your tradition correct mine? Where might mine correct yours? That kind of conversation requires humility stronger than insecurity. Another change would concern nature. A sacred ecology does not require pretending nature is gentle. Nature includes disease, predation, storms, decay, and death. Reverence does not mean sentimentality. It means relationship with limits. A forest can be used and still respected. Food can be taken from life and still received with gratitude. Human beings can build and still recognize that the land has conditions we did not create. The language of sacred rivers, mountains, and groves can help because sacredness establishes boundaries against total use. If everything is merely resource, the only limit is technical capability or market price. If something is sacred, another kind of limit appears. Not everything that can be taken should be taken. This may be one of the most important dharmic insights for any future age. The world is not infinite material waiting for infinite appetite. Limits are not punishment. Limits create form. A river without banks is a flood. A life without limits is not freedom. It is dispersion. Another change would concern silence. Imagine a civilization that considers silence a form of nourishment. Homes contain quiet without anxiety. Schools teach children to sit without stimulation. Religious spaces protect silence rather than filling every moment with amplification. Public life includes intervals when no one is selling, persuading, or demanding reaction. The idea sounds almost revolutionary because noise has become so normal, but the human nervous system did not evolve inside constant informational assault. Silence is not backward. It may be maintenance. The ancient association between silence and sacred perception suggests that the recovery of silence would be more than mental health practice. It would be preparation for depth, and perhaps this is where the gods would become recognizable again. Not because a civilization becomes superstitious, because it becomes perceptually available. A loud mind demands a loud God. A quiet mind can notice what whispers. The final age of darkness, then, may be understood as a crisis of volume, everything competing to be heard until nothing can be heard deeply. Kalki's sword creates silence after the cut. The old noise stops. In that silence, another order becomes audible. This interpretation may sound too gentle for an apocalyptic figure. But remember that genuine clarity is not gentle to everything, it is gentle to what is real. Severe toward illusion. The surgeon's cut harms tissue in order to remove what threatens the body. The difficult truth wounds an identity in order to free a life. The ending of a corrupt structure can create chaos for those dependent on it. Restoration has cost. The question is what the cost serves. This is why Dharma must remain central. Without Dharma, destruction can always call itself purification. History contains too many examples of people using sacred language to justify cruelty. No responsible reading of Kalki should turn mythology into permission for violence against people we label impure, corrupt, or demonic. The human tendency to project inner darkness onto an enemy is itself one of the patterns discernment must cut. A mythic battle belongs first to the moral imagination. If it teaches hatred more effectively than self-examination, something has gone wrong. The Dark Age ends when a dharma loses legitimacy, not when ordinary people are dehumanized in the name of ending darkness. This distinction matters especially whenever prophecy enters politics. Apocalyptic certainty can make compromise look like betrayal and opponents look like obstacles to divine history. That is dangerous. The tradition's scale should create humility, not fanaticism. If the Yugas span enormous cycles, no political movement owns the cosmic clock. If Kalki is an avatar of Vishnu, no internet personality can prove divine identity through charisma and prediction alone. If Dharma is the measure, then conduct matters more than claims. A person demanding worship is not made divine by saying the age is ending. A group demanding fear is not made truthful by using Sanskrit names. Discernment becomes more important, not less, when prophecy is involved. This may be one reason the deepest spiritual traditions repeatedly send the seeker back to practice. Observe, study, serve, remember, test. Do not surrender your intelligence in the name of mystery. Mystery is not the opposite of reason. Mystery begins where reason reaches its honest limit. Kali Yuga confusion begins when we cannot tell the difference between what is mysterious and what is merely unsupported. That is another cut of the sword. There is great freedom in saying, "This story is sacred to me, and I do not know how literally every part should be understood." There is strength in holding reverence and uncertainty together. A fragile faith needs every ancient claim to function like a modern fact. A mature faith can allow different kinds of truth to speak in different languages. Mythic truth, historical truth, psychological truth, metaphysical truth, ritual truth, poetic truth. They overlap, but they are not identical. The Kalki narrative can be a literal future prophecy for a believer and still carry symbolic instruction now. One does not require destroying the other. The Yuga chronology can be sacred cosmology and still invite questions about how time is interpreted. The old texts do not become smaller when we stop forcing them to answer questions they were not written to answer. They become deeper, and depth is what Kali Yuga lacks. So the world after the Dark Age is not something we can describe with confidence. Perhaps that is appropriate. If we could design Satya Yuga completely using a Kali Yuga imagination, we would probably recreate Kali Yuga with better decoration. The mind formed by an age cannot fully picture what lies beyond the age's assumptions. A person born inside noise imagines silence as lack. A person born inside competition imagines cooperation as weakness. A person born inside endless choice imagines limits as oppression. A person born inside material reduction imagines sacredness as superstition. A person born inside rigid tradition may imagine freedom as chaos. Every age has blind spots that feel like common sense. The next age, if it comes as the tradition's promise, would reveal some of ours. That revelation might embarrass us. Future generations may look back at certain habits we consider normal and ask how intelligent people accepted them. We already do this to the past. We forget that the future may do it to us. This is another reason humility belongs at the threshold. You are not standing outside history. Some of your obvious truths may be temporary conventions. Some of your most advanced habits may be remembered as primitive. Some things you dismiss may be recovered. Some things you worship may become warnings. The wheel does not ask permission from the present. It turns, and every turn rearranges what appears obvious. The only reliable protection is dharmic inquiry. Does this make us more truthful? More responsible? More awake? More capable of relationship? More able to restrain harm? More able to see beyond immediate appetite? These questions travel better across ages than fashion does. They are part of the compass. And now, after all the cosmology, all the warnings, all the discussion of chronology and symbols, perhaps the answer to the title can be said very simply. The gods return when the cycle allows their nearness to become ordinary again. Traditional chronology places that complete return beyond any near-human horizon. Alternative Yuga models place humanity at a different point in the cycle. No universally accepted modern date exists that allows us to say with confidence, this is the year. Anyone claiming certainty should be approached carefully. But the sacred can return to a human life before the calendar of the cosmos changes. That return begins wherever forgetting stops. It begins when a name is remembered with attention, when a duty is performed with sincerity, when desire is seen before it becomes command, when a river becomes relationship, when a parent becomes a human being instead of only a role, when a child becomes a trust instead of an extension of ego, when a teacher becomes accountable to truth, When a student values transformation more than identity, when death becomes a teacher instead of a forbidden subject, when silence becomes inhabited, when enough becomes possible, when a person stops demanding that the divine arrive in the form the ego prefers, these moments do not prove the age is ending, they prove the age does not own everything. That may be the most hopeful truth in the entire story. Kali Yuga can be long, it can be dark, it can make sacredness difficult to recognize, but it cannot make Dharma impossible. If it could, the tradition would have ended long ago. Instead, here you are, thousands of years after the oldest layers of these ideas emerged, listening to a story about Yugas in a world the early seers could not have described in technological detail. Languages changed, empires changed, borders changed, methods of transmission changed beyond imagination. The question survived. When will the gods return? The question survives because it still touches something alive. Perhaps what survives is not fear of apocalypse. Perhaps it is memory of nearness, a human intuition that reality should feel deeper than constant transaction, that consciousness should be more than reaction, that nature should be more than inventory, that relationships should be more than exchanged, that knowledge should change the knower, that life should contain something worthy of reverence. The word gods may name that intuition in one tradition. The word Dharma may organize it. The stories give it faces, the practices give it form, the silence gives it space, and the longing keeps the door open. The final night, what to carry with you. Now the story can become quieter. We have traveled far enough through the great clock. We have stood in Satya Yuga as the tradition imagines it. When truth is close and Dharma stands strongly, we watched the ages descend through Treta and Dvapara into Kali. We entered the age of forgetting and looked at its signs without pretending every modern problem is a secret prediction. We faced the long chronology of 432,000 years and the shorter interpretation associated with Sri Yukta's war. We let those maps disagree instead of forcing them together. We met Kalki on the white horse and allowed the sword to become more than a weapon, a symbol of discrimination, a cut between truth and appearance. We stood in twilight, where old and new overlap. We asked what the gods left behind and found seeds everywhere. Sound, story, breath, body, lineage, sacred place, conscience, devotion, service, longing. And now there is nothing left to chase tonight. The age will turn when it turns. History will become what countless actions make it. The cosmic mystery does not need to be solved before you close your eyes. This may be the deepest relief hidden inside cyclical time. You are not responsible for holding the universe together. The wheel turned before your birth. It will turn after your death. Your life matters, but it is not required to control the whole. Dharma gives you something smaller and more demanding. Be responsible for the part that passes through your hands, the sentence you speak, the promise you made, the body you inhabit, the attention you direct, the work you perform, the beings affected by your choices, the memory you preserve, the truth you are willing to see. That is enough for one life, more than enough. The mind may resist this because it likes cosmic drama. Cosmic drama allows us to escape ordinary responsibility. It is easier to watch for Kalki than to apologize, easier to study prophecies than to examine greed, easier to call the world dark than to notice the darkness we contribute, easier to dream of Satya Yuga than to protect one honest relationship. But Dharma keeps returning us to the ordinary, because the ordinary is where character exists. You cannot be truthful in theory. Truthfulness appears in sentences. You cannot be compassionate in theory. Compassion appears in how you respond to a being in front of you. You cannot be disciplined in theory. Discipline appears when desire asks for one thing and wisdom chooses another. You cannot be devoted in theory. Devotion appears when attention returns. This is why the smallest practices survive the longest. They can enter ordinary life, a breath before speaking, a name before sleep, a moment of gratitude before eating, a pause before reacting, a remembered verse in grief, a lamp lit without an audience, a hand placed on the earth, a promise kept when no one would know if it were broken. These acts are tiny compared with cosmic ages, but a human life is made from tiny acts. The universe may operate on millions of years. Character operates on moments. The bridge between them is Dharma. As you rest tonight, imagine the wheel not as something threatening, but as something vast enough to carry what you cannot. You do not have to push it. You do not have to stop it. You do not have to calculate every turn. You are standing on one small point of the circle. The point is real. It is not the whole circle. This is true of every problem in your life. A painful moment feels like the whole. It is a point. A successful moment feels like the whole. It is a point. Youth feels permanent. It is a point. Old age feels final. It is a point before another mystery. Civilizations feel permanent. They are points. Kali Yuga itself, however enormous, is a point inside a greater cycle. What would change if you remembered this more often? Perhaps you would hold success more lightly. Perhaps failure would become less absolute. Perhaps you would not need every disagreement to be settled tonight. Perhaps you would let some things remain unfinished until morning. The mind often creates suffering by demanding final answers from temporary moments. What does this mean forever? What will happen to me? Will they always think this? Will I always feel this? Is the world permanently becoming worse? The wheel answers gently, you do not know. And not knowing is not the same as danger. Sometimes it is simply the truth. The old seers looked at time on scales that make personal urgency quiet. Whether their cosmological numbers are read literally, symbolically, or devotionally, the emotional effect is similar. Your life is precious because it is brief. It is not precious because it is the center of everything. That distinction can free you. You can care deeply without believing everything depends on you. You can act strongly without imagining you control the fruit. You can love knowing that forms change. You can preserve what matters knowing you may not see what it becomes. This is the posture of the person carrying a seed. The seed does not prove spring. You plant it anyway. Maybe that is what every genuine teacher in Kali Yuga has done. Planted something they could not guarantee would grow. A word in one student, a practice in one family, a song in one village, a manuscript in one monastery, a question in one listener. The result belongs to time, the offering belongs to the person, and now this story becomes an offering too. Not a prediction that asks you to be afraid, not a timetable that asks you to wait for rescue, a reminder that darkness is never the only layer of a dark age. A reminder that traditions survive because human beings choose to remember. A reminder that the absence of the sacred from public life does not prove the sacred is absent from reality. A reminder that the divine, in the deepest Hindu philosophies, is not merely a visitor who comes and goes. Forms appear and disappear. Avatars enter history and depart. Temples rise and fall. Rituals change. Languages change. But Brahman is not another object inside time. The ground does not become absent because perception becomes clouded. This is why the question, where did the gods go, eventually turns into another question. Where did our attention go? Into fear, into comparison, into endless novelty, into resentment, into performance, into appetite, into arguments we will not remember a year from now, into images of lives we do not live, into the need to know what everyone else is doing. Attention leaves the temple long before the temple disappears, and attention can return, not perfectly, not permanently. Return is a practice. The mind wanders, bring it back. The heart hardens, notice. The ego performs, notice. Desire exaggerates, notice. Fear predicts, notice. Each noticing is a small clearing in the fog. You do not need to fight every thought. The sky does not fight clouds. It allows them to move. This is where the story of the ages meets the experience of meditation. Thought arises, stays, passes. Another arises. A mood becomes a world, then disappears. A fear becomes certain, then morning makes it look different. A memory returns with full emotional force, then fades. The mind contains tiny yugas all night long. Creation, preservation, dissolution, returns. Watching this can teach you something the cosmic numbers only symbolize. Nothing experienced remains unchanged. Even the one who says, I am always like this, changes while saying it. Breath changes, cells changed, thought changes, relationships changed, the body changes. The world changes. The insistence on permanence is often the source of fear. Kali Yuga feels unbearable when imagined as forever. The tradition removes forever. It gives the darkness an age. An age has a beginning. An age has a duration. An age ends. That is the gift of the wheel. Even if the duration is longer than we can comprehend, darkness belongs to time. It is not the final nature of reality. Hold that thought gently, not as a claim you must prove, as an image. A very long night still belongs to a world in which morning exists. The stars may be hidden by the city, but they have not been erased by the light below. The sacred may be hidden by noise, but hidden is not identical to gone. And perhaps the gods do not return from a place as much as they return from hiddenness. Vishnu from the story into responsibility. Shiva from the image into stillness. Devi from the shrine into the living earth. Krishna from the verse into discernment in action. Hanuman from the tale into service stronger than ego. Saraswati from the symbol into learning that humbles the learner. Lakshmi from wealth alone into abundance, joined with right use. Ganesha from ritual beginning into the intelligence that sees obstacles clearly. These are not replacements for devotion to the deities as real divine beings. They are ways their meanings become embodied. A god who remains only on a wall has not yet entered conduct. A teaching that remains only in sound has not yet entered character. The return becomes complete when symbol and life meet. That meeting can happen tonight in something very small. You do not need a vision. Perhaps you remember one person you need to treat better. Perhaps you see one habit that has been stealing attention. Perhaps you realize that a desire you have been feeding is not actually hunger. Perhaps you decide to stop pretending certainty about something you do not know. Perhaps you feel gratitude for a tradition you inherited without really noticing. Perhaps you simply become tired enough to release the need for an answer. Any of these can be a threshold. Not a cosmic threshold, a human one. The ancient traditions are filled with people who cross human thresholds before they understand their meaning. Arjuna collapses before he receives the teaching. Nachiketa asks death a question because ordinary rewards no longer satisfy him. The young Shankara leaves home in search of knowledge. Mirabai refuses to allow social expectation to define the direction of devotion. The Bhakti saints turn longing into song. Again and again, crisis becomes doorway when the old answer fails completely enough. This may be why Kali Yuga, for all its darkness, is never spiritually empty. Failure of the old answer creates space. The danger is what fills the space. Another distraction, another ideology, another promise of instant certainty or genuine inquiry. The age cannot choose for you completely. You stand at that small junction many times. Every time a familiar pattern fails, a sandhya opens. At twilight, you can rush to rebuild the old certainty or stay still long enough to see what the failure revealed. This is how inner ages turn, slowly, then suddenly. A person spends 10 years resisting one truth and understands it in one afternoon. Was the change 10 years long or one afternoon long? Both. Preparation was slow. Recognition was instant. This may help us understand why apocalypse is imagined as sudden after a long decline. The visible turn is fast because the invisible preparation was long. The seed breaks the soil in a moment after months underground. The sunrise appears after a gradual brightening. The sword falls after the confusion has reached the point where no smaller correction is enough. So if you ever feel tempted to ask whether current events prove the final turning is near, remember the scale of this story. Be curious, but do not surrender your judgment. Read the sources. Distinguish traditional chronology from modern reinterpretation. Distinguish scripture from commentary. Distinguish symbolic resonance from historical proof. Distinguish a pattern from a prediction. The desire to believe something dramatic is happening can make the mind easy to mislead. A strong spiritual life does not need exaggerated claims. Truth is enough. That sentence belongs to Satya even in Kali. Truth is enough. You do not need to make the ancient seers predict every modern invention for their insight to matter. You do not need to prove a secret date. You do not need to force science to validate every cosmological number. You do not need to pretend all Hindu traditions agree on interpretation. The story remains powerful without those shortcuts. Perhaps it becomes more powerful because honesty protects it from becoming another product of the age it criticizes. Kali Yuga turns everything into performance. Do not turn Kali Yuga into performance. Do not use the dark age to make yourself feel superior to people you call asleep. Do not use prophecy to feed contempt. Do not use spiritual hunger to escape ordinary duties. Do not use ancient knowledge as decoration for a modern ego. These warnings may matter more than any date. The person preparing for Satya Yuga should not become more arrogant, should not become more gullible, should not become more obsessed with enemies, should not become more detached from reality. The person should become clearer, kinder without becoming naive, stronger without becoming cruel, more disciplined without becoming rigid, more reverent without becoming blind, more skeptical without becoming empty, more capable of silence without becoming passive, more willing to act without needing to be seen acting. That is the human form of the white horse, energy under direction. That is the human form of the sword. Discernment without hatred. That is the human form of Shambhala. A protected inner place where something true remains uncorrupted. That is the human form of the preserved seed, a practice you keep alive. And that is the human form of return, the sacred becoming active in conduct again. When enough human beings live this way, Culture changes. When culture changes, what children consider normal changes. When what children consider normal changes, a new world can emerge without those children experiencing themselves as revolutionaries. They simply live inside a different atmosphere. Perhaps that is how ages ultimately become visible, not when one generation declares a new Yuga, but when later generations look back and realize the assumptions have changed. The people inside dawn do not need to shout sunrise. They begin seeing the road, and if the full traditional prophecy lies far beyond us, this still matters. Every age contains smaller dawns. Every family can turn. Every person can turn. Every institution can recover some truth. The cosmic night may continue while local lamps are lit. Do not underestimate lamps. Human beings survived long nights with lamps. They read by them, prayed by them, protected children by them, kept watch by them, prepared food by them. A lamp does not need to become the sun to have value. You do not need to become Kalki to carry clarity. You do not need to create Satya Yuga to make one truthful decision. You do not need the gods to walk visibly through the street before treating the street as part of a sacred world. This is where the question, when will they return, becomes less anxious. They return in the cosmic cycle when the cosmic cycle turns. They return in myth when Kalki restores Dharma. They return in human experience whenever the veil of forgetting becomes thin enough for sacred relationship to be felt again. 3 answers, one enormous, one prophetic, one immediate. The immediate answer is not a substitute for the others. It is the one you can live. Tonight, before sleep, you can test it. Not by forcing an experience, not by expecting a sign, simply by reducing noise for a moment. Let the question remain without rushing to answer it. When will the gods return? Notice what happens when the mind does not immediately fill the space. Maybe nothing happens. That is fine. Silence does not owe us an experience. Maybe you hear the room, a distant sound, your own breath, the small movement of the body settling, the day losing its grip. That is enough. The practice of sacred attention begins by allowing enough to be enough. Kali Yuga says more. One more video, one more answer, one more theory, one more prediction, one more thing before sleep. Dharma sometimes says stop. You have received enough for tonight. Let knowledge become quiet. This is important because knowledge that never becomes quiet cannot descend into understanding. The mind needs intervals in which ideas are not being added, like soil after rain. If rain never stops, roots drown. If information never stops, reflection becomes impossible. So let the story settle. The 4 ages, the long descent, the age of forgetting, the disputed clocks, the signs of weakened Dharma, the rider, the horse, the sword, the twilight, the seeds, the return. You do not need to remember every detail. Remember the shape. Darkness is a condition, not the ground of reality. Confusion is powerful, but it can be seen. What is seen clearly begins to lose its hidden power. Dharma can become difficult without becoming impossible. The sacred can become hidden without becoming absent. A tradition can become thin without breaking. A human being can live inside an age without giving the age complete ownership of the heart, and no season is forever. If the traditional chronology is correct, generations beyond imagination will continue carrying this story. Perhaps the languages will change so completely that none of our present words remain. Perhaps cities will stand where oceans are now. Perhaps technologies will exist that would look divine to us. Perhaps humanity itself will change in ways we cannot picture. Yet if Dharma is truly perennial, the same questions will remain underneath new forms. What is true? What is enough? What do I owe? What am I? What survives change? How should power be used? How do I live knowing I will die? Where is the sacred? These questions are older than our devices and younger than every child who asks them for the first time. That is why ancient wisdom can remain alive without predicting modern details. It speaks to structures of human existence. Those structures travel through time, the form changes, the hunger remains. And if Sri Yukteswar's shorter cycle is closer to the truth, then perhaps future generations will look back at our centuries as early, confused as stages of an ascent we barely understood. They may see our technologies as first signs of expanded capability mixed with old consciousness. They may see our global communication as a rough beginning of planetary awareness. They may see our crises as evidence that older systems were reaching their limits. Or perhaps they will see something completely different. We do not know. Let that sentence remain clean. We do not know. It does not diminish the story. It protects it from our need to possess the future. The future has never belonged to us, only the next action does. This was Arjuna's difficulty too, in another form. He wanted to know the consequence of action because consequence terrified him. Krishna's teaching repeatedly returns him to action without attachment to complete control of the fruit. You have a sphere of agency, use it. The rest belongs to a field larger than you. This may be the best way to live with prophecy. Let it orient, not dominate. Let it remind you of scale. Let it challenge complacency. Let it deepen practice. Do not let it steal the present through obsession with the future. A person can become so fascinated by the return of the gods that he misses the life in which devotion was supposed to occur. That would be the most Kali Yuga ending possible, searching for sacred history while ignoring sacred presence. So return now, not to a belief, to the simple fact that you are here, breathing, listening, temporary, aware, part of a chain that began before your memory and continues beyond your sight. People before you looked at the same night sky and wondered when the ages would turn. People before you feared decline. People before you saw institutions fail. People before you buried loved ones. People before you repeated divine names in uncertain times. Some believed the end was near. Some expected centuries. Some did not care about chronology at all. Still, the practices survived. That fact is its own kind of answer. The gods return because human beings keep making places for return. A shrine, a song, a text, a gesture, a disciplined mind, a generous act, a remembered story, a space of silence, a life ordered by something deeper than appetite. These are invitations, and perhaps divinity, however you understand it, has always entered through invitation rather than force. Even avatars are recognized differently by different people. Presence does not cancel freedom. The sacred can stand before a person who still refuses to see. This is one of the strange lessons of every religious story. Miracle does not guarantee understanding. People explain away what does not fit them. People worship what confirms them. People fear what changes them. So the final preparation is not to collect more signs. It is to become less defended against truth. That may be what prayer is at its deepest. Not, give me the world I prefer, but make me able to receive what is true. That prayer is dangerous in the best way. It gives the sword permission to cut. It gives the horse a direction not chosen by vanity. It turns Shambhala from a place we search for into a quality we protect. It turns Kali Yuga from an excuse into a training ground. And it turns the question of return into a question of readiness. Are you ready for the gods to return if return means losing what is false? Are you ready for Satya if truth exposes something you have protected? Are you ready for Dharma if duty costs convenience? Are you ready for sacredness if sacredness places limits on appetite? Are you ready for wisdom if wisdom makes you less certain about your own superiority? These are not questions you need to answer aloud. Let them rest where words become quieter. Sleep is close now. The day has carried enough. The old stories will still be here tomorrow. The wheel will still be turning. The unanswered questions will not disappear because you stop thinking about them for a few hours. Rest is not neglect. Rest is part of the cycle. Even the gods in Indian mythology enter forms of cosmic sleep. Vishnu rests upon the endless serpent, Ananta in the cosmic ocean, an image of stillness beneath creation. Worlds arise, endure and dissolve, while the deeper ground remains. Let that image become simple, not doctrine, not something you must interpret, just an image of vastness resting beneath movement. Your day was movement, thoughts, messages, tasks, faces, decisions, noise. Now let the surface become still. Nothing essential is lost because you stop controlling it for the night. The world continues, breath continues, time continues, the wheel continues. You are allowed to release your grip. Kali Yuga may be the age of restless grasping. Sleep is a daily refusal to grasp forever. Every night the hand opens. Every night the identity loosens. Every night consciousness enters a condition in which possession becomes meaningless for a while. The rich and poor both close their eyes. The praised and forgotten both become silent. The successful and unsuccessful both surrender the story of the day. Sleep makes temporary equality out of all the roles Kali Yuga teaches us to defend. Perhaps that is why bedtime is such a fitting place for this story. You do not need to carry your status into sleep. You do not need to carry your argument. You do not need to carry the future. You do not need to carry the entire dark age. Let it be large without becoming heavy inside you. The Yugas belong to cosmic time. This breath belongs to now. And now is small enough to hold. One breath enters. One breath leaves. No prophecy is required. No prediction. No proof. Just the oldest cycle you know personally. Receive, release, receive, release. If the universe truly moves in breaths, you are already participating. If it does not, the breath still teaches what the story teaches. Nothing can be held forever. Release is part of life. After release, space. After space, return. This is enough. The gods will return when the great cycle reaches the place the tradition assigns to their renewed nearness. Kalki will come according to the sacred narrative when Kali Yuga has reached its completion and Dharma must be restored. And the divine can return to awareness in any age, in any honest moment when the veil grows thin. That is the answer we can carry without pretending to know what we do not. It is large enough for faith, careful enough for reason, and quiet enough for sleep. So let the white horse disappear beyond the horizon now. Let the sword become only a line of light, then nothing. Let Shambhala remain where sacred places remain when no map can fully capture them. Let the ages turn without your supervision. Let Satya Yuga wait beyond whatever distance belongs to it. Let Kali Yuga be tonight what it is, a name for the difficult age through which generations have tried to remember what matters, and let yourself become one more person who remembers something simple. Truth matters, attention matters, Dharma matters, how you treat people matters, what you do with power matters, what you worship through your daily choices matters, what you preserve matters, what you release matters. The sacred does not need spectacle to matter. A quiet act can carry it. A quiet mind can recognize it. A quiet night can hold it. There is no need to force anything more. If the question returns tomorrow, let it return. When will the gods return? Perhaps the question itself is one of the seeds they left behind, a question designed to survive the age of forgetting because it contains memory inside it. You would not ask when they return, unless some part of the imagination still understood nearness. You would not long for Dharma unless disorder had taught you the shape of what is missing. You would not seek truth unless falsehood had failed to satisfy completely. Longing is not a rival, but it knows a direction. Follow the direction more carefully than the prediction, toward truth, toward attention, toward responsibility, toward reverence, toward the part of the self that does not need to be watched in order to behave well, toward the silence underneath the performance, toward enough. If the whole world moved that way at once, we might call it the beginning of another age. If only one person moves that way tonight, it is still worth doing. The wheel is vast, the step is small. Take the small step, then rest. Epilogue. Before the morning comes, there is one final image worth keeping. Not the rider, not the sword, not the dark age, a lamp. Imagine a lamp burning in a house while the entire countryside is dark. From far away, the lamp is almost nothing. It cannot end the night. It cannot command the sun to rise. It cannot illuminate the mountains or the roads beyond the village. But inside the room, the lamp changes what is possible. People can see one another. A child can read. Food can be prepared. A wound can be cleaned. A prayer can be spoken without stumbling through darkness. The night remains outside. But the night does not control everything inside. This is the role of Dharma in a difficult age. You do not need enough light for the whole world. You need enough light for the next true action. That is a much more demanding idea than waiting for rescue because it removes the excuse of scale. You may not be able to repair a civilization. You can refuse one lie. You may not be able to restore a river system. You can stop treating the living world as invisible. You may not be able to purify every religious institution. You can refuse to make your own practice a performance. You may not be able to correct the age's obsession with status. You can stop measuring one human being only by what they own. You may not be able to end the market of attention. You can protect 1 hour. This is how lamps survive. And perhaps this is how the gods remain present during the age in which they seem absent. Not always through visions, through qualities. Vishnu in preservation, Shiva in the courage to let a false form end, Devi in the power moving through life itself, Saraswati in knowledge joined with humility, Lakshmi in abundance joined with generosity, Hanuman in service that does not need recognitions, Krishna in intelligence that can act without becoming trapped by the fruit, Rama in duty carried even when duty is costly. The mythic forms remain greater than any single interpretation, but their meanings become alive when conduct gives them a place to stand. That may be what the word return has been asking us to understand all along. Return does not always mean traveling back from a distant place. Sometimes return means becoming visible again. A forgotten language returns when people speak it. A forgotten song returns when someone sings it. A forgotten value returns when someone chooses it under pressure. A forgotten god returns when a name becomes more than sound in the mouth of the person calling it. The tradition says the great return belongs to the wheel of time. Your small return belongs to attention. Do not confuse the two. Do not underestimate either one. One is cosmic, one is intimate. The intimate one is where you live, and now perhaps you can hear why the question feels so old. When will the gods return? It is not only curiosity about the future. It is grief for a lost quality of the present. Human beings can feel when life has become too thin. We may not agree on the explanation. One person says society has lost religion, another says community, another says nature, another says meaning, another says attention, another says trust, another says nothing was lost and that nostalgia is misleading. All of these voices contain something worth examining. The Yuga story gives one ancient answer. Dharma has weakened. And when Dharma weakens, the world can remain busy while becoming spiritually disoriented. Whether you accept that cosmology literally or not, the question it leaves you with is sharp. What makes life thick with meaning rather than merely full of activity? Perhaps that is the question to carry into sleep, not the date of Kalki, not the number of years remaining, not whether this century is secretly the final century. What makes one life aligned? What makes one day honest? What makes one relationship worthy of trust? What makes one use of power clean? What makes one moment sacred? The old stories cannot answer these for you without your participation. A scripture read without attention is ink. A mantra spoken without presence is sound. A ritual performed without sincerity is motion. A prophecy consumed without self-examination is entertainment. The missing element is always the living person, you, not because you are cosmically special, because practice requires a practitioner. Dharma has no hands in your life except the hands through which you act. No voice except the voice through which you speak truth. No schedule except the time you actually give it. No place except the places you refuse to treat carelessly. This is why the smallest choices become sacred without becoming dramatic. You choose what the age becomes in you. The age still surrounds you. Its pressure remains. But pressure is not destiny. The world can reward vanity and you can remain modest. The world can reward speed and you can remain careful. The world can reward outrage and you can remain discerning. The world can reward excess and you can remain measured. The world can turn every private experience into public display and you can keep something holy because it is not displayed. That last act may become increasingly precious, a hidden prayer, an unnamed act of generosity, a private discipline, a sacred memory never converted into content. Something the market cannot reach because you never offered it for sale. A small Shambhala within ordinary life. A place where the age is not allowed to enter completely. Protect such places, not from the world through fear, from your own impulse to expose everything. Mystery needs privacy. Love needs privacy. Grief needs privacy. Prayer often needs privacy. The inner life grows differently when it is not constantly looking at itself through the eyes of an audience. Perhaps one reason the sacred seems far away is that we have made so little room for anything that does not need to be shown. The gods of old stories often reveal themselves in forests, mountains, caves, dreams, battlefields, moments of crisis and quiet acts of devotion. Places where the ordinary script breaks. You do not need to seek danger or abandon society to understand the pattern. You need spaces where the usual script becomes quiet enough for another question to appear. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I value when I cannot display it? What remains when achievement is removed? What do I love when love gives me no status? What would I still do if no one ever knew? These questions lead away from Kali Yuga performance and toward something the age cannot easily consume. And so, before the morning comes, let the prophecy become smaller one last time. The white horse becomes your willingness to move when clarity has arrived. The sword becomes your willingness to distinguish what you wish were true from what is true. Shambhala becomes the inner ground you protect from corruption. The preserved teachings become whatever wisdom you refuse to let die through neglect. The twilight becomes the moment in which an old pattern has lost authority and a new way has not yet become easy. Satya Yuga becomes the direction of truth. Kali Yuga becomes the pressure toward forgetting. And Dharma becomes the path under your feet. You do not need to see the entire path. The lamp was never asked to illuminate the horizon, only the room. Let the room be enough tonight. Let the breath be enough. Let uncertainty be allowed. Let unanswered questions remain unanswered without becoming threats. The universe has carried unanswered questions for longer than any human life. It can carry yours until morning. If there is a final rider waiting somewhere in the unimaginable architecture of sacred time, your worry will not bring him sooner. If the age has hundreds of thousands of years remaining, Your despair will not make the night shorter. If a shorter cycle is unfolding and humanity is already moving upward, your excitement will not replace the work of becoming wiser. Every interpretation returns you to the same place. Live well now, remember now, see clearly now, do the next act of Dharma now. Then release the result. This is not a small answer, it is the only scale on which a human life can actually move. The rest belongs to time. And time, in the old Indian imagination, is not merely a straight road disappearing ahead. It is a wheel so vast that what seems lost can return, so patient that an age can last longer than civilizations, so mysterious that no generation can see the whole of it from where it stands. You are not asked to see the whole, only to remember that the whole exists. Kali Yuga is not all of time. Your fear is not all of you. This moment is not all of your life. The visible world is not necessarily all of reality, and absence is not always the same as abandonment. Sometimes what is absent from sight is simply waiting beyond the limit of the current light. Morning works this way. Long before the sun is visible, it is already affecting the sky. These refusals create space, and space is where another way of living can begin. Not with thunder, not with a date announced to the world, but with attention returning to what matters. If the great stories are right, one day the wheel completes its turn and Dharma stands strongly again. Until then, the work is simpler. Keep one lamp alive, keep one promise clean, keep one part of your mind beyond the reach of constant noise. Remember what deserves reverence. Let truth matter even when nobody rewards it. Let restraint matter even when appetite is praised. Let service matter even when no one sees it. And when the question returns, when will the gods return? Allow more than one answer. In the traditional cosmic story, when Kali Yuga completes its course, in the prophecy of Kalki, when a dharma has reached the limit that calls forth restoration, and in the intimate life of a human being, whenever forgetting loosens and sacred recognition becomes possible again, you do not need to force the morning. You only need enough light for the next step. The wheel is vast, your life is brief. Dharma meets you exactly where those two truths touch. Here, in this breath, in this choice, in this quiet night. Let the prophecy rest. Let the future remain with the future. The seed is still alive. The thread has not broken. Beyond every night, however long, morning still belongs to the cycle. Rest now.